For thousands of years, humanity has firmly believed that the epic poem, the Odyssey, is entirely a work of fiction. People view the bizarre creatures, the magical islands, and the fury of the ocean merely as products of the ancient Greek imagination. However, when we compare this epic to the ancient books hidden away in Ethiopia, or the clear records in the canonical Bible, a chilling truth begins to emerge. You will be surprised to discover that the existence of giants is absolutely real. So, what if Homer did not make up the one-eyed giants, the Cyclops? But in reality, he was just recording what remained of the bloodthirsty Nephilim race. Is the chilling similarity between the sea storm swallowing the land in the Greek epic and the catastrophe of Noah's great flood merely a coincidence? And why does the dark magic manipulating humans in the story bear the exact same shadow as the forbidden tricks that the fallen angels once secretly taught mankind? Tonight, stay with me until the final minutes of this video. Because when we unravel the incredible similarities between the two cultures, at the end, you will see with your own eyes the clearest historical evidence, the pieces that could turn everything you ever believed about the ancient world upside down. Now close your eyes, relax your mind, and let the true story begin. The Odyssey is not a fairy tale. It is a record of historical memory. Before placing the Cyclopean giants beside the race of the Nephilim for comparison, we must first clarify one fundamental question. Was Homer truly telling an imaginary story? Or was he preserving the blood-soaked memory of a world that once existed? Spread the map of the Odyssey out before your eyes. Troy was real. Messina was real. Pylos, Sparta, Crete, and Ithaca all clearly exist on the geographical map. The dangerous straits, volcanic islands, and maritime routes that Odysseus struggled to cross all belong to the real Mediterranean world. Homer clothed those locations in the language of mythology, but he certainly did not construct his stage out of nothingness. Behind the fury of the gods, beneath the violent storms and abnormal creatures, stands a world built from stone, bronze ship timber, sea salt, and human blood. The most appropriate place to open this record is Troy. For centuries, humanity assumed that Troy was merely a literary symbol. A magnificent city burned to the ground because of Helen's beauty sounded too perfect to be true, leading most scholars to believe that it existed only in Homer's mind. Then, the deep layers of earth at the hill of Hisarlik near the Dardanelles in present-day Turkey began to speak. Archaeological excavations beginning in the 19th century revealed a vast city composed of multiple layers of settlement built one above another. Troy had truly stood for thousands of years, possessing fortified walls, great gates imposing defensive towers, and a bustling residential district beneath the shadow of its citadel. By the end of the Bronze Age, this place had become a strategic choke point, controlling the entire vital passage connecting the Aegean Sea with the Black Sea. That choke point explains precisely why Troy became a target of war. Any fleet seeking to enter the Dardanelles had to pass through this region. Goods, precious metals, timber, food supplies, and control over the trade routes all converged at the gateway of the kingdom. A devastating conflict at Troy did not need to begin with a woman. Hidden behind the glorious image of Helen was the genuine memory of a struggle for control over seaports' power and survival among the mightiest empires of the late Bronze Age. Even sharper evidence lies deep within the clay tablets of the Hittites. Ancient texts from Anatolia directly mention a kingdom called Wilusa, a name that historians identify with Helios, the alternate name for Troy in Homeric epic. These documents also record the presence of a power called Ahiyawa, placing it alongside the Achaeans of the Mycenaean world. Even more astonishingly, A Hittite treaty clearly records the name of a king who ruled Wilusa Alexandru, a name whose pronunciation closely matches Alexandros, the alternate name of Prince Paris in Greek tradition. Those names affirm an undeniable truth during the exact period toward which the epic points. A powerful kingdom called Troy truly stood in northwestern Anatolia. The Greek Achaean powers truly surrounded and pressured this region, and the bloody conflicts around Troy were world-shaking events recorded by the empires of that age. In other words, Homer did not invent a war in an imaginary kingdom. He was retelling a genuine memory of war passed down orally through many generations, then forging it into an immortal epic. When we turn our eyes toward Greece, the historical evidence becomes even denser. Take Mycenae and Sirens as examples. These places still preserve systems of walls, palaces, and massive tombs, whose scale seems to challenge every limit of ancient engineering. We are not talking about ordinary bricks. These are enormous stone blocks, fitted perfectly together without mortar. Some of the stones weigh between 20 and 30 tons, and the lintel beam above the famous Lion Gate at Mycenae weighs as much as 100 tons. The Greeks, who lived hundreds of years later, when they wandered into these ruins after the age of collapse, stood frozen in disbelief. They looked upward at the scale of the walls and reached a single conclusion: human strength could never have lifted these stones. Some race of giants must have placed them together. And so the architectural term, Cyclopean, the architecture of giants, officially entered the vocabulary of history. And those walls are not legends. They still stand to this day. At Sirens, sections of the fortification cling tightly to the hillside, reaching as much as 8 meters in thickness and rising more than 13 meters high. They are the physical legacy of the powerful Mycenaean civilization that dominated the Eastern Mediterranean from the 15th through the 12th centuries before Christ. This was the very cradle that produced the kings, bronze-armored warriors, and life-or-death sea voyages that Homer spent his life singing about. But this creates a historical paradox that has sent a chill through generations of scholars. Homer repeatedly tells of the gigantic Cyclopean monsters. At the same time, the ancient Greeks lived and built their homes beneath the shadow of structures they believed had been shaped by the hands of the Cyclopes themselves. So did the legend of the giants already exist and later become attached to those walls? Or did the irrational size of the ruins force later generations to resurrect a race of monsters in order to explain their origin? That is the central question we will unravel shortly. But first, look more deeply into the human world of the Odyssey. If you travel to Pylos today, you will stand upon the foundations of the Palace of Nestor. There, archaeologists discovered a priceless treasure buried beneath the ashes of an ancient fire. A vast archive of clay tablets inscribed in the writing system known as Linear B. For decades, no one could read them. It was not until the middle of the 20th century, when the writing system was successfully deciphered, that scholars were stunned to realize that it was not a foreign language. It was an extremely ancient form of Greek. More importantly, these tablets do not record poetry or mythology. They are cold accounting records detailed to an almost disturbing degree. They precisely list every weapon storehouse, the number of chariot supplies of barley, enslaved people, bloody sacrificial rituals, and an entire system of strict taxation. They are hard, undeniable evidence, confirming one truth many centuries before Homer composed his epic: a real Greek world had already existed. It was a kingdom operated by powerful kings who controlled enormous treasuries and governed a complex administrative network whose tentacles reached across the Mediterranean. That is the world Homer was describing. In the epic Telemachus, the son of Odysseus leaves the island of Ithaca and sails to Pylos and Sparta in search of information about his father. Those locations are certainly not dream realms. They were real centers of power. Gold-rich Mycenae truly was a sacred burial place, where the elite were laid to rest beside priceless treasures. Sandy Pylos truly stood in the region of Messina. Homer used epic poetry to preserve the image of an age far older than the one in which he himself lived. And this is the greatest central point. The Odyssey took written form in the 8th century before Christ, yet the entire atmosphere of the story reaches backward to the end of the Bronze Age, hundreds of years earlier. Between those two periods came the catastrophic collapse of the Mycenaean palaces, the disappearance of writing, and a prolonged dark age, during which historical memory remained alive only through the voices of wandering singers. Homer did not labor over archives of written documents like a modern historian. He stood at the final point of an oral current that had flowed through dozens of generations. Beside the fires of great halls during nights of fierce celebration, singers told and retold the story of a lost world. Each generation may have added a few details, but the central names, the battlefields, and the collective psychological wounds remained rooted permanently. The Iliad and the Odyssey are oral archives holding captive layers of genuine memory from the Bronze Age. For this reason, the Odyssey is not a dry historical chronicle, yet it is certainly not a fairy tale born from pure fantasy. It is an audio recording of human memory. Within that archive, historical events, maritime dangers, and unfamiliar barbarian tribes became woven together. A real city destroyed by fire became a playground of the gods. A violent storm at sea became the wrath of Poseidon. A deadly strait rose up in the form of a ship-devouring monster. The outer layer is mythology, but the fear buried within it comes from a brutal reality. Try placing yourself in the position of a sailor drifting across the sea more than 3,000 years ago. Your ship is built only from joined pieces of timber. The physical strength of human beings pulling the oars is its only source of propulsion. There is no navigational radar. There are no satellites providing storm warnings. A dark line of clouds approaching from the horizon carries a sentence of death. A sudden underwater current can tear the hull apart against the rocks. An unseasonal wind can sweep an entire fleet into lands with no names on any map. In a world filled with such helplessness, the boundary between physical geography and bloodthirsty monsters becomes thinner than ever. Homer describes Scylla and Charybdis as two evil beings guarding a narrow body of water. One reaches out with hideous heads to seize sailors, while the other swallows the sea and spits it back out like an enormous boiling cauldron. Since ancient times, this danger has been identified with the Strait of Messina between Sicily and southern Italy, where extremely dangerous currents collide within a narrow channel. Studies of ancient navigation demonstrate that the way Odysseus crossed this region carries the remains of a practical survival lesson. One in which a captain had to make a brutal decision between striking submerged rocks and being dragged into a whirlpool. Homer personified the danger as a monster, but that danger had already been waiting with its jaws open long before his verses were born. And this is the psychological pattern that decodes the entire journey of Odysseus. The lands near his home are given precise names: Troy, Sparta, Crete, and Egypt. But as the fleet is swept farther away from the familiar world, the map increasingly disappears into mist. At that uncertain boundary, the island of the sorceress Circe, the land of the lotus eaters, and the cliffs of the giants begin to appear. Many modern analyses attempt to trace the map of Odysseus using the accuracy of the islands to attract viewers, but our investigation tonight will go deeper than that. The uncertainty at the edge of the map does not remove the historical character of the work. Instead, it accurately reflects the lens through which ancient people viewed the world. Inside the circle of safety were lost city-states and trade. Beyond the edge of the map were wild tribes, deformed creatures, and gigantic skeletons lying deep inside dark caves whose origins no one dared to explain. When surviving sailors crawled ashore, they told others about the horrors they had witnessed. After several generations of oral transmission, a tall warrior became a giant. A bloodthirsty tribe became a race of cannibals. A violent rumbling from deep inside a cave was attributed to a monstrous creature. Mythologizing always draws its raw material from genuine trauma. That is precisely why we must proceed with extreme caution and refuse to dismiss the Cyclops as a childish product of imagination. Real geography does not automatically prove that the creature was real. The reality of Troy does not mean that the goddess Athena once descended to Earth. But that historical accuracy forces us to change completely the way we question Homer. So, what horrifying experience, what real creature, or what fragment of historical memory forced the Greeks to create the image of this monster? When you place the text of the Odyssey beside archaeological discoveries and ancient spiritual scrolls, everything begins to connect, forming a truly terrifying picture. Homer did not portray dreamlike beings floating through the clouds. He described something intensely physical and savage. The Cyclopes lived hidden inside dark caves and knew how to raise livestock. They possessed muscular strength far beyond ordinary biological limits, yet they despised civilization. These creatures refused to live in communities, rejected every moral principle, and trampled upon every human law. Look at the way the tyrant Polyphemus acts. He seizes the helpless sailors of Odysseus, smashes their heads against the cold stone floor, and devours them one by one. Viewed from an investigative perspective, this is not the instinctive behavior of a mindless animal. It is an extraordinarily precise criminal profile of an intelligent race, possessing a brutally violent nature and a craving for human flesh. And what sends a chill through researchers is that this description matches almost perfectly with an ancient document preserved thousands of miles from Greece, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the biblical tradition. More specifically, we are speaking about the Book of Enoch. This text clearly records the Nephilim giants born from the forbidden union of fallen angels. According to the description within this document, they were also abnormally large and completely lawless. When the Nephilim consumed all the food and exhausted the resources of the earth, their uncontrollable hunger drove them to begin hunting human beings. They tore their victims apart, devoured their flesh, and drank their blood exactly as Polyphemus did inside the dark cave. At this point, archaeology has already proven that Homer's historical stage was real. Therefore, the greatest question tonight no longer concerns the authenticity of the locations. What we truly need to decode is this. What remains did the ancient Greeks uncover, or what horrifying fragment of memory did they gather that allowed them to portray a race of man-eating giants almost identical to the Nephilim? To search for the truth, step with me directly into Book 9 of the Odyssey. This is the moment when the enormous stone crashes down and seals the entrance of the cave, completely cutting off every escape route for the sailors. And from within that thick darkness, a towering creature enormous beyond every law of nature begins moving toward them. Polyphemus, the criminal record of a mysterious race. Odysseus and 12 battle-hardened warriors leave their ship, cross the shoreline, and follow a rocky slope leading directly to an enormous cave. Standing before its entrance is a forbidden enclosure built from massive stones interwoven with towering pine trunks and oak trees. Inside, the entire space is divided with extraordinary precision, separate areas for lambs, young goats, and newly weaned animals. Baskets are filled with cheese. Enormous vessels containing milk and whey are arranged neatly in rows along the rocky walls. Every trace at the scene clearly confirms one fact. This place has an owner, but this is certainly not the home of a human being. This is the deadly domain of Polyphemus. Homer introduces this creature through a chilling comparison. Polyphemus lives completely separated from his own kind, tending his livestock alone and carrying within him a thoroughly lawless nature. Homer does not compare him to a muscular warrior or a mighty king. He describes the creature's body as resembling a forest-covered mountain peak, isolated, hideous, and completely separated from the mountain range behind it. Homer provides no precise numerical measurement for the height of Polyphemus. He uses a far more terrifying method. He uses the objects surrounding the scene to reveal the true proportions of the creature's body. When Polyphemus returns to the cave, he carries an enormous bundle of firewood. The sound of the wood crashing onto the stone floor of the cave is so terrifying that the veteran warriors' men who had survived the blood-soaked battlefield of the Trojan War panic and flee deep into the darkness. He then raises one arm, lifts an enormous boulder, and places it across the cave entrance as easily as an ordinary person closes a bedroom door. Homer states decisively that 22 of the strongest four-wheeled wagons would be powerless to move that stone. Yet Polyphemus moves it with one hand. Inside the cave also stands a solid olive wood club that he intends to use as a walking staff once the wood has dried. Odysseus sees it, and his mind immediately compares it to the mast of an enormous merchant ship of immense carrying capacity fitted with 20 oars. Later, after being blinded and discovering that his prey has escaped Polyphemus, tears away part of a mountain in his rage and hurls it directly into the sea. The weight of the rock striking the water creates a horrifying hydraulic shockwave, reversing the current and nearly throwing Odysseus's ship back onto the shore. That is how Homer measures the body of the Cyclops, through a doorway sealed by a stone that human strength could never move, through a walking staff the size of a great ship's mast, and through a rock powerful enough to transform a calm sea into a tidal wave. Later Greek tradition firmly established the image of Polyphemus as a savage man-eating giant with a single eye in the center of his forehead. Within the Odyssey itself, Odysseus's plan for survival depends entirely upon destroying that eye. 5 strong men must combine their strength merely to lift the burning wooden stake and drive it deep into the creature's eye socket, much like shipbuilders drilling through a thick wooden plank. Yet, his deformed appearance is only the first layer of this criminal record. What makes Polyphemus truly terrifying is not his eye. It is the way this creature lives. The Cyclopes in the Odyssey are never described as citizens of a society. They establish no governing council, possess no shared system of law, and have neither ships nor craftsmen. This race cuts itself off from the outside world and lives in isolation, scattered among rocky caves along the mountainsides. Each male exercises absolute authority over his wife and children, while remaining completely indifferent to the Cyclopean families living nearby. This is a biological population that exists only in family groups. Every cave is an independent kingdom. Every male is the supreme law. Physical power crushes every form of communal order, and no moral authority exists that can force them to answer for their actions. Look closely at the extreme contrast Homer is revealing. Just across the sea lies the civilized world of the Greek city-states. Despite constant warfare and political crimes, the people there still maintain public squares, councils of elders' laws, burial rites for the dead, and rules protecting foreign guests. But upon entering the territory of the Cyclopes, the boundary between good and evil disappears. This creature defines morality according to the power of his own fist. The land is endlessly fertile, yet they refuse to cultivate it. An island rich in resources lies just across the channel, yet they refuse to build ships. They possess every condition necessary to construct an empire, yet they choose to imprison themselves inside dark caves, tend sheep, and enjoy the absolute power of predators. However, Polyphemus is certainly not a mindless beast, and this is the detail that pushes the record to its most brutal level. He understands animal husbandry. He knows how to separate livestock by age, how to milk them, ferment cheese, and preserve stored food. He follows a strict biological schedule, driving his sheep into the fields at dawn and bringing them back into the cave at dusk. He recognizes each animal in his flock and even speaks tenderly to his favorite breeding ram after losing his sight. Polyphemus possesses language. He possesses memory. He possesses the ability to organize his thoughts. He possesses an emotional attachment to his animals. And he is intelligent enough to question Odysseus about the location of his ship, intending to eliminate every possible escape route for his prey. Therefore, the slaughter that follows cannot be blamed upon the hunger instinct of an animal. It is the cold-blooded choice of a fully conscious being. When Odysseus stands before Polyphemus, he does not draw his sword. He appeals to the most sacred law of the ancient Greek world, the inviolable rights of a guest. In Homeric society, a lost traveler was required to receive food, shelter, and protection before being questioned about his identity. Zeus himself was the protector of travelers and strangers. Odysseus therefore openly asks Polyphemus to shelter them out of reverence for Zeus. The response of Polyphemus exposes the nature of a demon. He bursts into laughter and mocks Odysseus. He boldly declares that his race stands above Zeus and is more powerful than all the gods. He claims that he will spare a weaker person only when doing so pleases him. This is not the rudeness of an uneducated being. It is a declaration of war issued by absolute violence. Within the worldview of Polyphemus, the strong are immune from every court of judgment. His enormous body grants him the right to trample morality beneath his feet. Only seconds later, that declaration is transformed into blood. Homer recounts how Polyphemus seizes two men and smashes them against the stone floor as mercilessly as someone killing puppies. The victims' skulls shatter and their brains splatter across the cave floor. He tears their bodies into pieces, devours all their flesh, and internal organs, crushes their spines between his teeth and sucks the marrow from their bones. He does not cook the flesh. He performs no sacrificial ritual, and he leaves no part of the bodies behind for burial. He devours the two human beings as a mountain lion consumes fresh prey. When he is finished, he drinks an entire container of pure milk and falls peacefully asleep among his sheep. The following morning, when the first rays of sunlight enter the cave, he seizes two more men and repeats exactly the same bloody process. Pause here and analyze this detail carefully. This is not a murder committed during a sudden explosion of rage. This is a process of livestock management and consumption. At night, he eats two men. He sleeps. He wakes. He tends his livestock. In the morning, he eats two more men. For this creature, human flesh is an essential part of the daily food chain. Even when Odysseus offers him excellent wine, Polyphemus uses his evil intelligence to mock the sacred law of hospitality. He promises Odysseus a special favor. He will eat Odysseus last, forcing him to watch as every one of his companions is chewed apart. The crime is carried out with full awareness, habitual repetition, and a diseased sense of humor. The complete behavior of Polyphemus creates a perfect portrait of an intelligent hunter of human beings, physically superior, isolated from society, ruling his territory through terror, trampling upon the law, and addicted to human flesh. Now take this psychological criminal profile and place it carefully beside the ancient Hebrew texts describing the Nephilim. In chapter 6 of the book of Genesis, the Nephilim appear when the sons of God unite with the daughters of humanity. Their descendants are remembered as mighty warriors from ancient times. The King James Version translates Nephilim directly as giants. Many generations later, chapter 13 of the book of Numbers continues portraying the Nephilim through the sons of Anak giants, who caused the Israelite spies to tremble and describe themselves as being as small as grasshoppers. The canonical Bible records the account with extraordinary brevity, but the Book of Enoch expands that picture into an apocalyptic record. Chapters 6 and 7 of Enoch clearly recount how 200 fallen angels known as the Watchers descended upon Mount Hermon, seized human women, and produced a race of giants. At first, these creatures devoured everything human beings produced. When humanity became exhausted and could no longer provide enough food for them, the hunger of the giants turned its spear directly against the human race. They began to eat human beings. They slaughtered the birds of the air, the wild animals, the reptiles, and the fish of the sea. Finally, in their madness, they tore one another apart and drank the blood of their own kind. The text closes with the earth crying out and accusing the lawless giants of their crimes. At this point, the pieces begin fitting together with a chilling sound. The first similarity is easy to recognize. The strength of Polyphemus extends far beyond that of an ordinary human being. Homer never tells us precisely how tall he is. Instead, he allows Odysseus to witness what the creature can do. Polyphemus lifts the stone blocking the entrance to the cave, even though more than 20 wagons could scarcely move it. His club is almost as large as a ship's mast. When Odysseus escapes, he hurls an enormous rock into the sea and nearly sinks the ship. The Bible remembers the Nephilim in a similar way. Genesis calls them mighty warriors of ancient times. In Numbers, the Israelite spies say that standing before their gigantic descendants made them feel as small as grasshoppers. Homer and the Hebrew texts do not provide the same measurement, but both describe a race possessing height and strength that left ordinary human beings with almost no chance of resisting them. The next similarity is even more terrifying. Both Polyphemus and the giants in the Book of Enoch eat human beings. When Odysseus asks to be received as a guest, Polyphemus does not hesitate. He seizes two soldiers, smashes them against the stone floor, tears their bodies apart, and eats their flesh, internal organs, and bone marrow. The next morning, he wakes, milks his sheep, and captures 2 more men for another meal. For Polyphemus, this is not an act of lost control. He eats human beings as part of his everyday life. The Book of Enoch tells an almost identical story. At first, the giants consume everything produced by humanity. When the food is no longer sufficient, they begin eating human beings, then continue by attacking animals and drinking blood. In both stories, the giants possess a hunger that the surrounding world cannot satisfy. They take all the food, destroy human life, and finally transform human beings themselves into food. The third parallel lies in the way Polyphemus views the law. Odysseus reminds him that Zeus protects strangers and punishes those who treat helpless travelers cruelly. But Polyphemus only laughs. He declares that the Cyclopes are stronger than Zeus, and that he will do whatever he desires. This is the world of the Cyclops. They possess no common council and no laws obeyed by everyone. Each individual lives in his own cave, rules his family according to his own will, and depends solely upon physical strength. The Book of Enoch also describes the Nephilim through violence and lawlessness. Genesis chapter 6 states that the earth had become filled with violence during that age. Both accounts reveal one very simple truth. When the strong believe that they stand above the law, the weak become their victims. To Polyphemus, the people who enter his cave are merely food. To the Nephilim, all humanity ultimately becomes the target of their hunger and violence. The fourth similarity is the way they live outside human society. Polyphemus can speak, raise sheep, make cheese, and care for livestock. He possesses memory and the ability to calculate. Yet, he does not live in a city conduct trade or desire any participation in human society. He lives inside a rocky cave, establishes his own law, and uses physical power to control everything that enters his territory. The Nephilim share a similar characteristic. According to the Book of Enoch, they were born after the Watchers abandoned their appointed positions and united with human women. The children born from those unions lived among human beings, yet the way they existed destroyed human life. The Cyclopes and the Nephilim possess forms close enough to humanity for communication, yet their size, strength, and behavior turn both races of giants into threats to every nearby community. The final similarity lies in the origin of Polyphemus. Homer states very clearly that he is the son of Poseidon and the sea goddess Thoosa. This means that Polyphemus was never understood as an ordinary human suffering from a medical condition that caused excessive physical growth. From birth, he belonged to a supernatural bloodline. The origin of the Nephilim also extends beyond ordinary ancestry. Genesis recounts that they appeared when the sons of God came to the women of the earth. The Book of Enoch identifies those beings as the rebellious Watchers. The two traditions contain clear differences. Poseidon and Thoosa belong to Greek religion, while the Watchers belong to Hebrew tradition and are regarded as rebellious angels. Yet the way the two stories explain the giants is similar in one important respect. They are not ordinary human beings who grew naturally. Both Polyphemus and the Nephilim are connected to supernatural origins. Are Homer and the Hebrew tradition describing two completely different races, or are they preserving the same ancient memory under two different names? The Greeks called them Cyclopes. The Hebrews called them Nephilim. Polyphemus possesses an enormous body. A supernatural origin lives outside the law and eats human beings. The Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim with those same characteristics: extraordinary size, an unnatural bloodline, limitless violence, and a hunger that ultimately turns toward humanity. One similarity could be a coincidence, but 5 matching characteristics immediately form a body of evidence. Ancient merchants and sailors may have carried shared historical traumas throughout the Mediterranean and the Near East, after which every nation repackaged those memories through its own language and religious tradition. And there is an even more terrifying truth. Polyphemus is only the beginning. After escaping from that blood-soaked cave, the fleet of Odysseus encounters the Laestrygonians, a second tribe of giants. But these creatures do not live in caves. They build an entire kingdom, organize large-scale ambushes, and chew the heads of sailors as though they were hunted prey. This means that the Cyclopes are not an isolated mutation. Within the world of the Odyssey, at least 2 communities of man-eating giants exist. One group lives scattered in isolation. The other establishes an empire. Both haunt the escape route of the surviving warriors of the Bronze Age. Is Homer repeating a literary motif to increase the drama, or is he carefully recording the history of real giant races that once occupied the frontiers of the ancient world? The answer is hidden within one devastating detail. A detail directly connecting the appearance of the Cyclopes with Noah's great flood, which swept across the surface of the earth. If Polyphemus truly represents the surviving physical lineage of the Nephilim, an enormous paradox immediately erupts. The entire race of the Nephilim should have been completely destroyed by the waters of judgment during the flood. How then could creatures carrying the same brutal genetic code continue to emerge within Homer's story, thousands of years after the waters had receded? The memory of destruction, Poseidon's wrath, and the great flood. At the end of the previous section, we were left standing before an enormously explosive question. If the entire race of the Nephilim had been crushed beneath the force of the great flood, how could creatures identical to them, such as the tyrant Polyphemus, continue appearing in the journey of Odysseus many generations later? The first answer lies directly within the biblical record. Genesis chapter 6 clearly records that the Nephilim ruled the earth during the age before the flood. Yet the text then inserts an extremely troubling detail, and also after that. Those 4 short words provide solid evidence that the bloodline of the giants was not completely extinguished when the waters receded. Several generations after the time of Noah, the book of Numbers, chapter 13 reports their reappearance through the sons of Anak. When the Israelite spies entered the territory of Canaan, they returned in a state of overwhelming terror and reported that the rulers of the land were descendants of the Nephilim. Standing before these beings, the Israelite warriors felt as small as grasshoppers. Although that report was deeply colored by fear, it still confirms a historical reality. The Israelites were fully aware of the existence of a race of giants that continued wandering across the earth after the judgment of Noah. This explains a very specific mechanism of survival. After a global disaster of extinction, the surviving creatures are often scattered. Some attempt to rebuild civilized society, But the wildest and most dangerous elements retreat deep into inaccessible mountain regions, imprison themselves inside caves, or drift toward isolated islands beyond the edges of the known world. That is precisely where Homer located the Cyclops. They lived on desolate islands beyond familiar maritime routes. They rejected the establishment of society, refused to build ships, and completely severed all trade with the outside world. And the Cyclopes were not the only example. The Laestrygonians, another tribe of giants in the Odyssey, chose a similar way of life. When the fleet of Odysseus accidentally wandered into their territory, these giants immediately poured out, crushed the ships, and devoured the sailors alive. Clearly, the desolate lands beyond the boundaries of civilization provided the perfect refuge in which the remnants of the ancient world could prolong their final existence. And now we must open another record, an independent report from the Greek world. We are certainly not taking the biblical story and deliberately forcing it onto the Odyssey. We have no need to do that because ancient Greek culture possessed its own separate record of the Great Flood. The central witness within this account is Deucalion. In Greek mythology, Deucalion was a righteous man and the son of Prometheus. He lived within an age when humanity had become completely corrupted by violence, arrogance, and contempt for the law. The most horrifying crime of that age belonged to King Lycaon to test whether Zeus could truly see all of things. Lycaon murdered a human being, cooked the victim's flesh, and served it at a banquet for the supreme god. Zeus immediately recognized the scent of blood. Lycaon was cursed and transformed into a werewolf, while his entire dark family line was destroyed. But the god's wrath did not end with one individual. Zeus looked down upon the earth and saw that violence had spread like a disease into every corner. Human beings slaughtered one another freely and treated cannibalism as a source of pleasure. To purge this corruption from its roots, Zeus decided to use the ultimate weapon, water. The judgment was declared. The powers of the seas and rivers were commanded to overflow their boundaries. Rain poured down like a waterfall, smashing houses apart, swallowing fields, and erasing entire cities. People fled in panic toward the highest mountain peaks, but the waters continued rising mercilessly until they overtook them. Deucalion, after receiving a secret warning from his father, constructed an enormous chest or a small vessel with his wife, Pyrrha. They brought food inside and sealed the entrance immediately before the disaster struck. They drifted upon those deadly waters for 9 days and 9 nights. When the waters of judgment began to recede, the vessel came to rest upon a mountain peak, usually identified by scholars as Mount Parnassus. Deucalion and Pyrrha stepped outside. The entire former civilization had been erased. They offered sacrifices of thanksgiving and became the first seed of a new age. By this point, the neurons in your brain have almost certainly begun making connections. In Genesis, God sees that the earth has become filled with violence. The moral structure has completely collapsed. Noah, a righteous man, is selected to survive. He receives a warning. He builds an enormous vessel. He brings his family inside. The waters surround the earth and crush every living being outside. When the waters recede, the vessel comes to rest upon Mount Ararat, and Noah's family emerges to rebuild humanity. Certainly, the two stories differ in the identities of their characters, their timelines, and their theological perspectives. The Zeus of Greek mythology is not the god of the Bible. The chest of Deucalion also lacks the enormous structure of Noah's Ark. Yet the central structure of the scene matches with chilling precision. An age of violence erupts. Murder and cannibalism spread throughout the world. A death sentence through water is issued. A righteous man receives a secret warning. There is miraculous survival aboard a drifting vessel. The landing takes place upon a mountain peak, and humanity is reborn upon the ruins of the former world. This is precisely why we affirm that the Great Flood is not the exclusive property of any single religion. The Hebrews called the survivor Noah. The Greeks called him Deucalion. The Mesopotamians called him Atrahasis or Utnapishtim. The names change. The languages change. The ways civilizations imagine the supreme being also change. But the historical core remains standing. The ancient world once descended to the lowest depths of brutality. A catastrophic flood swept across the surface of the earth, and only a very small group survived to preserve the memory. This historical intersection brings us directly back to the tyrant Polyphemus. Within Homer's record, Polyphemus is a man-eating giant who rules through violence and tramples upon the law. Within the record of the Book of Enoch, the Nephilim exhaust the world's resources and then turn toward devouring humanity. Within the Greek record of King Lycaon, human sacrifice and cannibalism become the final provocation that causes the disaster to descend. And within all these accounts, water consistently serves as the instrument of execution. This correspondence does not automatically replace the word Cyclopes with Nephilim upon the written page, but it proves one point with tremendous force. The Greeks were not unfamiliar with this story. They possessed their own scar, left by the Great Flood. They clearly remembered an age of extreme violence. They were haunted by cannibalism, and they understood water as a symbol of punishment. Most importantly, they recorded the stubborn survival of gigantic beings within remote wilderness regions after the disaster had ended. The Hebrews and the Greeks did not independently invent two similar works of fantasy. They were record keepers. They preserved memories of the same brutal historical scene and then expressed those memories through the language of their own people. Both reports, although traveling through two separate oral traditions, point toward the same global catastrophe. And one event within the Odyssey makes this connection sharper than ever before. After Odysseus uses a burning wooden stake to destroy the eye of Polyphemus, the blood-covered giant runs toward the shore and cries out to his father, the god Poseidon, demanding revenge. Poseidon answers him. From that moment forward, the sea becomes a machine of destruction aimed directly at Odysseus. Poseidon unleashes enormous storms that tear the fleet apart, cast the helpless sailors into the depths of the sea, and condemn the king of Ithaca to wander without direction for 10 years. Within the story of Deucalion, water is the instrument used to execute a lawless generation. Within the Odyssey, water becomes the punishment directed against the man who dared to harm the bloodline of the giants. Within Genesis, water erupts when the earth has become irredeemably consumed by violence. All three stories, despite their different settings, roar with the same blood-soaked message when violence crosses the final boundary. Supreme judgment will inevitably descend. Homer did not invent Polyphemus out of nothing. This tyrant is the physical remnant of a memory older than the birth of Greece itself. He is evidence of a race of giants that once ruled the world through violence, developed a hunger for human flesh, and somehow successfully escaped the purging power of the Great Flood, allowing them to continue reproducing within the darkness. And the most terrifying fact is that Polyphemus was not alone. After escaping from the cave of the Cyclops, the fleet of Odysseus reaches a quiet harbor surrounded by towering cliffs. 11 ships calmly sail deep into the bay. Guided by a sharp instinct for survival, Odysseus decides to anchor his own ship alone outside the entrance to the harbor. That small decision saves his life from disaster. The magnificent city standing before them is the stronghold of the Laestrygonians. It is an empire of organized giants, possessing a king and crowded streets. And naturally, they consider human beings the main course on their menu. The Laestrygonians, the deadly city of the giant race. Polyphemus represents an individual giant living in isolation inside a rocky cave. But the journey of Odysseus quickly reveals an even more brutal truth. Somewhere beyond the known world, an entire society of giants exists that regards human beings as its primary source of food, water. After drifting across the sea for 6 days and 6 nights, the sailors arrive in the land of the Laestrygonians. Before them lies a sheltered harbor enclosed by 2 high cliffs stretching along the shore. Two headlands extend towards one another, leaving only a narrow entrance between them. Inside, the water is so calm that the ships can rest closely beside one another. To sailors who have endured storms for many days, this place appears to be a perfect stopping point. 11 captains guide their ships deep into the harbor one after another and secure them close to the shore. The vessels gather within a small area of water, protected by the surrounding cliffs. Odysseus makes a different choice. He keeps his ship outside the harbor entrance and ties it to a rock near the shore. He then climbs to a high point to observe the land ahead. From there, Odysseus sees a column of smoke rising in the distance. The smoke shows that people live in this land, but the surrounding landscape remains quiet. He decides to investigate before bringing his entire crew ashore. Odysseus chooses 2 men and sends a herald with them. The 3 men leave the shoreline and follow a level road leading toward the city. This is the route normally used by wagons carrying timber down from the mountains. That detail shows that the Laestrygonians have established an organized community. They possess Rhodes transport wagons, a shared water source, and a city located farther inland. As they approach the city, the 3 Greeks encounter a young woman drawing water from the spring of Odyssey. She is the daughter of Antiphates, king of the Laestrygonians. The scouts ask her about the inhabitants of the land and the person who rules them. The girl immediately directs them toward her father's towering house. At this point, everything still unfolds like an ordinary encounter. 3 visitors ask for directions. A local girl answers them. Ahead stands the house of the king who governs the city. But when they step inside, they meet the girl's mother. Homer describes the Laestrygonian queen as possessing a body as enormous as a mountain peak. Her appearance causes all 3 men to freeze immediately. The queen summons her husband from the city's place of assembly. This detail further demonstrates that the Laestrygonians possess a clearly defined social system. They have a king, a queen, a royal family, and a gathering place for the people. King Antiphates enters. He sees the 3 visitors, walks directly toward them, and seizes one of the men. Within seconds, that man becomes the king's meal. The other 2 immediately turn and run. They rush out of the house, race along the road they had just traveled, and attempt to return to the harbor before the entire city catches them. Antiphates releases a tremendous cry. The call echoes throughout the city, and the Laestrygonians begin pouring toward the harbor from every direction. Homer describes them as resembling giants rather than ordinary human beings. They quickly occupy positions upon the high cliffs surrounding the harbor. Below them, the 11 Greek ships remain packed closely together within the narrow waterway. Their only escape route lies through the small harbor entrance ahead. The ships farther inside must pass several other vessels before they can reach the open sea. The harbor that once appeared to offer safety now becomes a trap created by the landscape itself. From above, the Laestrygonians lift enormous rocks and hurl them directly down upon the fleet. The rocks strike the decks, the hulls split apart, the oars break, the masts collapse among the sailors struggling to escape. The ships lie too close together, so when one vessel is destroyed, it immediately blocks the path of the ship behind it. The sound of splintering timbers, screaming men, and falling rocks fills the harbor. The survivors leap into the water. The Laestrygonians use long spears to impale them as people spear fish. They then drag the bodies ashore and carry them back to the city as food. This is a hunt in which the entire community participates. King Antiphates begins by eating 1 man inside his own house. The population continues the hunt at the harbor. The giants standing upon the cliffs destroy the ships, while those near the water use spears to capture the swimming sailors. Violence operates here as a communal activity of the city. Odysseus witnesses everything from his ship anchored outside the harbor. The small distance separating his position from the other 11 ships determines the fate of the entire expedition. He draws his sword, cuts the mooring rope, and orders his sailors to seize their oars immediately. The men aboard the ship use all their strength to drive the vessel towards the open sea. Behind them, the Laestrygonians continue throwing rocks and killing those trapped inside the harbor. The ship of Odysseus passes through the narrow entrance. moves beyond throwing distance and reaches open water. The remaining 11 ships are destroyed where they lie. Only one ship survives. The decision by Odysseus to keep his vessel outside the harbor saves both him and the men traveling with him. This story gives us another complete record of the giants within Homer's world. Polyphemus lives alone, inside a cave, cares for his flock, and rules his private territory. The Laestrygonians construct an entire city. They possess families, a king, a queen, transportation routes, a water source, an assembly place, and a harbor large enough to receive an entire fleet. This shows that the giants in the Odyssey appear within different forms of society. The Cyclopes live as separate families. The Laestrygonians live as an organized people. Yet cannibalism remains present within both communities. Polyphemus captures those who enter his cave and eats them immediately. Antiphates does the same to the scout who enters his house. Afterward, the entire population of the Laestrygonians participates in hunting the sailors and carrying them away as food. Here, the consumption of human flesh has become a custom accepted by the entire city. The king performs it before his family. The people join the hunt when they hear his call. The captives are carried back to the city like trophies taken after a successful hunt. The Laestrygonians therefore represent a greater threat than Polyphemus. Odysseus once confronted a single giant inside a rocky cave. At Telepylus, he confronts hundreds of giants, coordinating their actions and using the landscape to destroy an entire fleet. Homer also describes their strength through very specific actions. The rocks they throw from the cliffs possess enough force to smash the hulls of ships. Their spears are long and powerful enough to pierce sailors swimming in the water. Within a short period, they destroy 11 ships and most of the people aboard them. This detail recalls the way the Bible describes the giant lineages of Canaan. Numbers chapter 13 mentions the sons of Anak and connects them with the Nephilim. The Israelite spies see them and feel as small as grasshoppers. Deuteronomy describes the Anakim as a tall and powerful people, so formidable that people repeated the question, who can stand against the sons of Anak? Within the same book, the Emim are described as a numerous people as tall as the Anakim and counted among the Rephaim. King Og of Bashan is identified as one of the remaining Rephaim, possessing an iron bed of exceptionally great size. The Bible and Homer use different names and place these communities within separate settings. Even so, both traditions preserve memories of tall peoples renowned for their strength and capable of creating deep fear in those who encountered them. Polyphemus represents the power of a single individual. The Laestrygonians reveal what happens when that power becomes an organized collective. They possess territory, a king, a system of communication, and the ability to coordinate and attack. And they regard human beings as a source of food. Polyphemus shows us a solitary man-eating giant. The Laestrygonians reveal something far more terrifying, a complete society of giants in which human beings are hunted like livestock. After that attack, Odysseus has only one ship remaining. The survivors continue rowing in anguish, carrying the memory of their companions who were murdered before their eyes. Their next destination brings them to the island of Circe. There, the nature of the danger changes completely. Physical strength gives way to potions, incantations, and the power to transform human beings into animals. And that story will lead us toward another connection with the Book of Enoch. The forbidden knowledge that the Watchers once transmitted to humanity. Circe and the Forbidden Arts. After the horrifying massacre in the empire of the Laestrygonians, the mighty fleet of Odysseus was crushed, leaving only a single ship behind. The survivors continue clinging to their oars, carrying the overwhelming psychological trauma of having watched hundreds of their companions become prey. At last, they reach the shore of Aea, the domain of the sorceress Circe. Homer outlines Circe's background with extraordinarily sharp details. She is not a goddess who reigns from the summit of Olympus. She possesses the appearance and voice of a human being, yet carries a supernatural bloodline. She is the daughter of Helios, the god of the sun, and the goddess Perse. Her family line was notorious for its ability to manipulate herbs, magic, and forbidden arts, extending far beyond human understanding. After reaching the shore, Odysseus and his exhausted group of survivors collapsed beside the sea for 2 days and 2 nights while recovering from their wounds. On the 3rd day, the instinct for survival awakened. Odysseus carried his spear and sword and climbed a high cliff to scout the surrounding land. From there, he discovered a thin column of smoke rising from the middle of the dense forest. In the ancient world, smoke signified 3 things: food, shelter, and the presence of human beings. That was precisely the lifeline the sailors desperately needed. Odysseus returned to the beach and divided the remaining men into 2 companies. He commanded one half and placed the other under Eurylochus. They drew lots from a bronze helmet. Eurylochus drew the lot that required him to lead 22 men deep into the forest. The scouting party quickly located its target. Circe's residence was an exquisitely constructed stone mansion standing in the middle of a clearing. But the scene surrounding the house sent out an extremely unusual warning. It was guarded by enormous mountain lions and wolves. Even more frighteningly, the wild animals did not attack. When they saw the strangers, they stood upon their hind legs, wagged their tails, and greeted them obediently and joyfully, exactly like domesticated dogs. Homer clearly records that Circe had stripped away their wild instincts through the use of special drugs. This disturbing scene reveals one truth: the owner of the house possesses a formula capable of directly interfering with the nervous systems and behavior of living creatures. From inside the residence came Circe's gentle singing, accompanied by the clicking of her loom. The comfortable surroundings and soothing voice created a perfect psychological trap, causing the warriors who had only recently escaped death to lower their guard completely. Circe opened the door, smiled, and invited them inside. The 22 men obediently followed her. Only Eurylochus stopped. A soldier's instinct warned him that something was wrong, so he chose to hide behind a tree and observe from a distance. That decision saved his life. Inside the mansion, Circe graciously arranged seats for her guests and personally prepared a feast. She took a large bowl and blended rich cheese barley meal and honey into fine Pramnian wine. Then, in the final step, she secretly added a poisonous substance capable of erasing all memory of home. The food placed before the sailors possessed enough sweetness, richness, and fragrance to overpower every trace of reason. The hungry and exhausted men drained the bowl of wine without realizing what they had just swallowed. As soon as the substance entered their blood and overwhelmed their nervous systems, Circe acted immediately. She took her magical wand, coldly struck each man upon the head, and drove them all into a pig pen. Before the horrified eyes of Eurylochus, who remained hidden outside the biological structures of the sailors, were forcibly transformed. Their heads, faces, limbs, and skin swelled distorted, became covered in coarse hair, and changed into the bodies of fully grown pigs. But this was the most sinister detail of the sentence. Their minds remained unchanged. They were completely conscious. They remembered their names and recognized the faces of the companions standing around them. They fully understood the tragedy that had just occurred, and they realized that they had been completely deprived of the ability to speak in human language. Circe contemptuously threw acorns and leftover food into the trough. The men who had once fought proudly through oceans of blood at Troy now stood behind a wooden fence, weeping bitterly inside the bodies of animals. Close your eyes for a moment and place yourself inside that psychological prison. Your brain remains completely intact. You still clearly remember your home, the face of your loving wife, and the children waiting for you. But when you attempt to extend your hand, you see a hoof. When you open your mouth to call for help, the only sound that emerges is the grunt of livestock. Anyone looking from the outside sees only an animal, while inside that body is the soul of a man, screaming in despair. This level of manipulation turns Circe into a threat more terrifying than any act of biological poisoning. she does not kill her victims. She isolates their consciousness inside a prison of flesh. After witnessing everything, Eurylochus exhausted all his strength, running desperately back toward the shore. When he came face to face with Odysseus, he was suffering from severe psychological shock. Tears streamed down his face. His breathing came in broken gasps, and a great deal of time passed before he could describe the scene of the crime. After hearing the report, Odysseus did not hesitate. He immediately took up his sword and set out. Eurylochus fell to his knees and begged him to remain behind. The trauma of the massacre by the giants had convinced Eurylochus that anyone who crossed the threshold of that sorceress was accepting a certain death sentence. But Odysseus refused to turn back. While traveling through the forest, he encountered Hermes, the god appearing in the form of a young man. Hermes understood all of Circe's methods and gave Odysseus an antidote, an herb called moly. Homer records that the moly plant possessed a black root and a flower as white as milk. Human beings could not pull it from the ground through physical strength. Only supernatural power could obtain it. Hermes laid out an extremely detailed battle plan. Odysseus had to keep the moly root with him to protect his nervous system. Calmly drink the entire bowl of Circe's poisoned wine and then wait for her to raise the wand. When the poison was neutralized and the transformation failed, Odysseus had to draw his sword. His sword immediately overpowered Circe, force her to swear an oath, and order her to release his companions. Everything unfolded precisely according to Hermes' plan. Circe enthusiastically welcomed her new prey. She seated him upon a silver-studded chair, personally mixed the poisoned wine inside a golden cup, and handed it to the king of Ithaca. Odysseus calmly drank it all. No biological transformation occurred. Circe raised her wand, struck him upon the shoulder, and ordered him to enter the pig pen. In response, Odysseus suddenly drew his razor-sharp sword and placed it directly against her throat. Circe's panicked reaction revealed a fatal weakness. The entire power of this sorceress depended 100% upon the victim consuming the drug and losing the ability to defend himself. When confronted by a conscious will protected by an antidote and resisting with cold, decisive violence, Circe immediately lost control. She collapsed, wrapped her arms around the knees of Odysseus, and frantically demanded to know the identity of the man who had neutralized her poison. She quickly realized that he was Odysseus, the very name Hermes had once warned her would eventually reach Aeaea. Odysseus delivered an ultimatum. Circe had to swear a sacred oath that she would end every attempt to harm him. Most importantly, she had to restore the human forms of his sailors before he would allow any food inside the house to touch his lips. With no other choice, Circe took another medicinal antidote, entered the pig pen, and applied it to the body of each animal. The reversal process began. The coarse hair fell away. Arms and legs formed again. Human faces reappeared. The sailors recovered their human bodies and even appeared younger and stronger than before. When they recognized their captain, they rushed toward him, embraced him tightly, and burst into tears. Even Circe stood silently before the depth of their emotion. This valuable detail exposes Circe's entire method. She possesses the drug that takes away physical form, and she also possesses the antidote that restores it. The magical wand is merely an external triggering device. The force that truly changes the biological structure from within comes from the chemical reactions of the herbs. Circe uses her singing voice, fine wine, and hospitality as tools of psychological manipulation, persuading her victims to enter the trap willingly. And it is at this point of intersection that Homer's record begins connecting directly with the Book of Enoch. In chapter 7 of Enoch, the text clearly records the actions of the fallen angels known as the Watchers. They descended to the earth and secretly taught women how to use incantations, sorcery, how to cut roots, and how to prepare plants. By chapter 8, the record reveals the details more fully. The angel Semjaza teaches humanity how to cast spells. Beside him, the angel Armoros teaches humanity how to break enchantments. Do you see this chilling correspondence? Semjaza teaches how to set the trap. Armaros teaches how to remove it. Circe possesses both the poison of transformation and the antidote of restoration. Within both records, advanced knowledge of roots and plants is consistently connected with the ability to invade the nervous system, alter behavior, and manipulate the biological structure of human beings. The Book of Enoch affirms that these were forbidden secrets stolen from heaven. Ultimate, the problem did not lie within the knowledge itself, but within the purpose for which it was used. The Watchers transformed knowledge into an instrument serving greed, manipulation, and corrupt power, pushing humanity farther and farther away from the natural order of the Creator. Circe is the perfect embodiment of that abuse of knowledge. She uses a magnificent feast to purchase trust. She uses chemical poison to destroy reason. And she uses the wand to complete the process of imprisoning the soul inside the body of an animal. The mountain lions and wolves guarding the mansion are also victims of the same formula. Human beings and wild animals alike have been reduced to biological experiments, satisfying her hunger for power. Homer writes his story in Greek. The Book of Enoch records its account through the Hebrew tradition. Yet both place this form of forbidden knowledge into the hands of beings carrying supernatural bloodlines. Circe is the daughter of the god of the sun. The Watchers are rebellious angels. And the most painful point they share is this: mortal human beings always become the experimental subjects and the victims who suffer the consequences of those occult games. However, the deepest lesson within this part of the epic lies not only in the method of manipulation, but in the way Odysseus breaks its power. Odysseus reverses the situation through alertness. He enters the enemy's stronghold with a clear mind equipped with an antidote, gripping his sword firmly and forcing his opponent to submit. The rescue does not come through blind magic. It comes through guidance from Hermes, the ability to distinguish between right and wrong, and the power to act decisively. After being defeated, Circe's role turns by 180 degrees. She changes from a predator into a protector. She provides food, gives the men shelter for an entire year, and most importantly, supplies invaluable intelligence. Circe herself shows Odysseus the way into the underworld and warns him about the next deadly traps known as the Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis. This proves an enduring principle. A tool is always neutral. True power belongs to the one holding the handle. Knowledge of metallurgy can forge a plow, but it can also produce swords and spears. Knowledge of medicinal herbs can create medicine that saves lives or poison that controls the mind. When knowledge rests in the hands of an arrogant being like Circe, it creates a pig pen. But when that knowledge is overcome by the reason and strength of Odysseus, it becomes a map for survival. At this point in the journey, the record of the Odyssey has revealed 3 entirely different forms of crime within the ancient world. Polyphemus uses the muscular strength of an individual giant to crush his victims. The Laestrygonians use the organized system of an empire to hunt human beings. Circe uses chemical substances and sorcery to manipulate the mind and imprison the soul. And when we place these pieces beside one another, the complete picture sends a chill through us. The giants are counterparts of the Nephilim. Cannibalism is a lingering consequence of the violent age before the flood. Circe's forbidden arts are the corrupt legacy that the Watchers spread across the earth. But the journey of Odysseus has not yet ended. If Homer was truly using poetry to conceal records of the temptations and crimes that devastated the ancient world, then what kind of power does the next trial represent? The answer hangs within an enchanting sound rising from an island in the middle of the ocean. A song that knows the precise weakness of every man. A song promising to give them limitless knowledge, absolute satisfaction, and the fulfillment of every emptiness within the soul. But every ship that trusts the promise and turns toward the island will pay the price by leaving its bones exposed upon the beach. It is the deadly call of the Sirens. The mystery of the Sirens' real existence. After leaving the island of the sorceress Circe, the battered fleet of Odysseus was immediately thrown into a threat of an entirely different nature. Look back at the records of the enemies they had already encountered. Polyphemus used physical strength to crush his victims inside a cave. The Laestrygonians used massive stones and spears to slaughter an entire fleet. Circe used chemical poisons to imprison the body. But the Sirens did not need to shed a single drop of sweat. Their only weapon of death was sound. Before entering Homer's crime scene, we must completely remove the distorted image created by modern popular culture. The Sirens were not beautiful mermaids with elegant fishtails. The ancient Greeks preserved a far more horrifying physical profile. According to archaeological artifacts authenticated by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Sirens possessed the faces of women, but the bodies of birds with enormous wings and sharp claws. This grotesque image of a bird with a human face originated in the Near East and Egypt, later spread into Greece, and evolved into female creatures possessing voices of death. Only after many centuries were their forms made more feminine. Given arms with which to play musical instruments and eventually transformed by the medieval world into the image of mermaids. Archaeology possesses an extremely clear map, tracing the physical evidence for the existence of this image. On the island of Cythera, archaeologists excavated a terracotta vessel shaped like a siren originating from Crete and dating to approximately 600 years before Christ. Numerous similar vessels have also been discovered resting inside ancient temples and tombs throughout Greece and Italy. In the region of Boeotia, a bowl dating to the 6th century before Christ clearly depicts a creature with the body of a bird and the head of a human being. During the same period, artisans on the island of Rhodes also produced numerous small statues of sirens. But the most valuable piece of evidence is now housed in the British Museum. It is known as the Siren Vase, a ceramic masterpiece produced in Attica around 480 to 470 before Christ, yet excavated at Volci, a city of the Etruscan civilization in present-day Italy. The surface of the vessel precisely recreates the scene from the Odyssey. Odysseus is bound tightly to the mast. The sailors strain themselves as they row with urgency. The sirens, possessing grotesque bird-like bodies, perch upon the rocks surrounding the ship. One siren dives headfirst into the sea and kills herself after the fleet passes safely through their territory. This map of physical evidence proves an astonishing truth. The sirens were not a fictional story created for entertainment upon one small island. The concept of these creatures spread from Attica, took root as far away as Etruria, and haunted the entire Roman world. Most significantly, ancient artisans repeatedly depicted the sirens upon gravestones, funerary urns, and ritual objects. In murals, they play music mourn or stand waiting above the bodies of the dead. The Greeks firmly connected the image of the sirens with three things: music, death, and the soul's journey into the underworld. Archaeology has not provided us with the skeleton of a human-bird hybrid, but it does provide powerful psychological evidence. The great civilizations surrounding the Mediterranean collectively shared, feared, and transmitted the same image of a malevolent creature for hundreds of years. Now return to the deck of Odysseus's ship. After the king returned alive from the underworld, Circe summoned him to deliver a life-or-death intelligence briefing. The first threat she mentioned was the sirens. Circe described the modus operandi of these creatures. Any man who entered the range of their song would immediately lose all desire to survive and completely forget the idea of returning home. His wife and children would wait for him in vain, while the sailor's body would rot forever upon the island. The crime scene was described in horrifying detail. The sirens sat singing in the middle of a beautiful meadow. Yet surrounding them were mountains formed from human bones, with dried pieces of human skin still clinging to the remains. This detail exposes the way the sirens took lives. They did not carry weapons and pursue the ship. They did not need to launch any physical attack. The victims themselves turned the rudder, guided their own ships into the rocks, and walked willingly to their deaths at the very place where the previous bodies were already decomposing. To confront them, Circe gave Odysseus a strategy designed to neutralize the senses. The sailors had to soften beeswax and seal their ears completely. The rowing crew would temporarily make themselves deaf. Odysseus alone, because of his ambition to obtain knowledge, would be permitted to listen. In return, however, his hands and feet had to be bound to the mast with knots strong enough to resist death itself. The order was brutally strict, no matter how loudly he screamed or commanded them to release him. The sailors were permitted to do only one thing: tighten the ropes even further. Odysseus followed every detail of the plan with absolute precision. As soon as the ship entered the border of the island, nature suddenly reacted. The wind died completely. The surface of the sea became as smooth as a deadly mirror. The crew lowered the sails, gripped their oars, and used human strength to drive the ship forward. Odysseus used his sword to cut a block of beeswax into pieces, softened them beneath the heat of the sun, and personally sealed the hearing of every sailor. They then pressed him firmly against the great mast, twisted his arms behind his back, and wrapped thick ropes tightly around his body. The ship moved silently into the forbidden territory. As soon as the distance became close enough for the sound waves to reach them, the sirens began to sing. And this is where the highest form of psychological manipulation appeared. The first thing they did was call Odysseus by his real name. They knew his identity. They knew he had just survived the slaughterhouse of Troy. They praised him as the great glory of the Achaeans and poured into his ears an invitation that only they could fulfill. The sirens promised that anyone who remained to hear their song would depart possessing supreme wisdom. They claimed to know every drop of blood and every moment of suffering endured by the Greeks and Trojans during the war. Beyond that, they declared that they possessed the universal key, capable of unlocking every secret operating upon the earth. Examine this bait carefully. The sirens did not promise treasure or gold. They did not use the sexual beauty of their bodies to seduce him. They aimed directly at the captain's fatal weakness, his hunger for fame and his thirst for knowledge. Odysseus was the mind that created the strategy of the Trojan horse. He defined himself through superior intelligence. He had witnessed too many companions fall, and deep within him, his traumatized mind was crying out for an explanation of all that brutality. The sirens called him by name, stroked his enormous ego, and promised to provide the final answer. This was not merely a song. It was a customized psychological attack designed specifically for the mind of Odysseus. You may faintly understand the terror of this experience if you have ever driven alone on a highway at night and suddenly heard a song on the radio connected to a painful trauma from your past. For a few brief moments, mind is completely pulled away from the present. But the power of the sirens was 10,000 times more brutal. It detected the deepest opening within the victim's soul and used its full intensity to collapse the entire structure of reason. The moment those sound waves struck his eardrums, Odysseus broke down. He frantically signaled for the sailors to release him. He frowned, nodded, twisted every muscle in his body, and used every possible gesture to command them to set him free. But iron discipline prevailed. Paramedes and Eurylochus immediately stood up. They ignored the madness of their captain and coldly obeyed the military order. Established in advance, they wrapped dozens of additional coils of rope around Odysseus, tightened them firmly, and returned to their rowing benches. The deafened crew bent over their oars and rowed furiously, driving the ship forward. Odysseus endured the full force of those deadly sounds while his body remained nailed to the mast. He survived not because he was stronger than temptation, but because he had established a system of physical restraint before the temptation appeared. When the demonic sound finally faded into the noise of the waves, the sailors removed the beeswax from their ears and cut the ropes to release their captain. The territory of the sirens officially disappeared behind them. This case record establishes 3 supernatural abilities possessed by the sirens. First, they possessed a clairvoyant intelligence network, allowing them to know the identity of the approaching person. Second, they understood every trauma within the target's past. Third, they combined those two pieces of knowledge to create an invitation that the human mind could not resist. Homer focused upon the destructive power of their sound waves. Greek artists completed their physical profile by giving them bird bodies, claws, and women's faces. The combination of poetry and archaeology creates a complete summary female beings of supernatural origin who manipulate knowledge and use their voices to drive humanity toward death. More importantly, the Sirens were not enemies encountered exclusively by Odysseus. In another great maritime epic known as the Argonautica, the fleet of the hero Jason and his Argonauts also encountered them. When the Sirens began singing their death-bearing song, the warrior Orpheus immediately seized his instrument, gathered all his strength, and played and sang a melody powerful enough to overwhelm the sound waves of the monsters and keep the rowing crew alert. However, one sailor named Butes was still manipulated. He lost control, threw himself into the sea, and began swimming toward the Sirens. He escaped death only because the goddess Aphrodite directly intervened immediately before he reached the shore. This event provides the testimony of an independent witness, confirming that the Sirens belong to a much wider historical trauma than Homer's epic alone. Two independent fleets encountered the same type of creature. Both identified them as living upon an isolated island. Both recorded their ability to draw men away from ships through sound waves. And both cases required extreme methods of blocking sound in order to survive. Later, Greek tradition identified the Sirens as the offspring of the river god Helios and one of the Muses. Ancient records provide numerous variations of their individual names, yet three central characteristics remain unchanged. A form that is half woman and half bird. Sound waves capable of manipulating the mind, and death as the final destination. And at this historical point of intersection, our investigation once again carries us directly to Ethiopia. The Book of Enoch. An ancient text preserved intact through the Ethiopian language reveals another astonishing hidden detail. The text records the rebellion of the fallen angels known as the Watchers. They abandoned heaven, descended to the earth, united with mortal women, and produced the bloodthirsty race of the Nephilim. These women were the biological mothers of the Nephilim giants, and they could not escape the judgment imposed upon that great rebellion. In chapter 19, the archangel Uriel leads Enoch to a region where the fallen angels are imprisoned. The text clearly states that the dark spirits arising from this rebellion would continue wandering, manipulating human beings, and leading humanity into the worship of false gods. Immediately afterward, a brief line appears like a flash of lightning. The women of the angels who sinned shall become Sirens. This is one of the most astonishing and fiercely debated statements in the entire history of research into the Book of Enoch. The Greek manuscript tradition explicitly uses the noun Sirens. However, some translations from the Ge'ez or Ethiopian tradition use a phrase meaning shall become peaceful. The original Aramaic text of this particular line remains missing, pushing scholars into an ongoing linguistic battle. Yet the reality remains that numerous respected English translations and leading scholars have chosen to preserve the noun Sirens because it corresponds closely with Greek tradition and with the logic of reconstructing the ancient text. However, we must read this record with absolute precision. The Book of Enoch does not call the Sirens the descendants or daughters of the Nephilim. The text identifies the Sirens as the women who united sexually with the Watchers. To state the matter directly, if the Greek translation preserves the original message correctly, then the Sirens were the biological mothers of the man-eating race of giants, later transformed in appearance as a punishment or as another form of existence after the catastrophe. Now place the pieces upon the investigation board. The correspondence between the two civilizations immediately erupts. The women in the Book of Enoch originally possessed human bodies. The Sirens in Greek art retained women's faces, while their bodies were transformed into birds. The women in Enoch gave birth to giants who devoured human flesh and crushed human bones. Homer's Sirens sat calmly upon mountains built from the remains of their victims. The Watchers brought forbidden knowledge, magic, and astrology to the Earth in order to manipulate humanity. The Sirens used the promise of granting knowledge of all things to lure human beings toward their own deaths. But the most disturbing intersection lies in the way they kill. The Sirens use no physical force. They infect the mind and cause human beings to surrender their lives voluntarily. In exact correspondence, chapter 19 of the Book of Enoch declares that the task of the spirits connected with the Watchers is to use invisible manipulation to lead humanity astray, persuade people to offer sacrifices to false gods, and gradually drag them toward destruction. Was Homer using the outer form of epic poetry to recount the fate of the women who once gave birth to the Nephilim? Modern archaeological science cannot yet place an official seal of confirmation upon this enormous hypothesis. Archaeology can provide only statues, ceramic vessels, murals, and gravestones. These artifacts prove that the image of the Sirens became deeply embedded within the cultural DNA of numerous empires and remained closely connected with the ocean music and death. They are the remains of an enormous cultural memory rather than biological DNA specimens. Yet, the astonishing statement within the Book of Enoch prevents us from ignoring this connection. Homer recounts a record of female creatures who use their voices to drive human beings toward death. Greek art permanently establishes their identity as women-bird hybrids. Ancient funerary rituals summon them to stand beside the bodies of the dead. The Argonautica provides further independent testimony, and ancient Jewish tradition directly applies the name Sirens to the women who became accomplices in the rebellion that gave birth to the Nephilim race. One culture may accidentally create an image for the purpose of teaching a moral warning. But when multiple independent civilizations, extending across many centuries, share the same system of characteristics with such precise detail, the evidence leads toward a systematic conclusion. Behind the mythology of the Sirens, there must once have existed a real entity, a cult, or a historical event. It may have been the memory of secret orders of female priestesses who controlled isolated islands using auditory hallucinations and intoxicating substances to slaughter traveling merchants. And if we place our confidence in the accuracy of the Book of Enoch, then the Sirens were the surviving legacy of the age of the Watchers, beings of human origin, who became corrupted after crossing a supernatural boundary and continued existing as predatory spirits under different names. The present report leads us toward a cautious but extraordinarily powerful conclusion. Homer did not casually invent the Sirens merely to enrich a few lines of poetry. He deliberately placed Odysseus before an entity that had manipulated the Mediterranean world since remote antiquity. The Book of Enoch then provides a supernatural genealogy that offers a complete explanation for the origin of that entity. If the words "the women of the angels shall become Sirens" are original, then this correspondence welds Homer's world directly to the center of the record concerning the fallen angels and the Nephilim giants. It is a double legacy of crime. Their giant sons used physical strength to crush the bones of humanity. Their mothers used sound to implant death within the minds of men. Odysseus survived the territory of the deadly sound because the ears of his sailors had been sealed with beeswax, and because his body had been bound tightly to the mast before the hallucination began. But the moment their ship crossed beyond the boundary of the Sirens, the peaceful waters ahead suddenly began to boil. The sea opened its mouth. To the left stood a black whirlpool, powerful enough to drag an entire fleet into the abyss. And waiting in ambush upon the cliffs on the opposite side stood a biological machine of destruction possessing 6 long necks, 6 hideous heads, and 3 rows of jagged teeth extending from each enormous mouth. The true nightmare was named Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla and Charybdis, the death sentence in the Strait of Messina. The moment the ship escaped the range of the Sirens and the sailors pulled the beeswax from their ears, a hydrological nightmare immediately appeared before them. Clouds of water vapor rose between 2 enormous cliffs. The waves crashed against the rocks with a roar, like a boiling cauldron preparing to explode. This was the moment when the warnings of the sorceress Circe struck directly into the mind of Odysseus. The only route home forced his fleet to pass through an extremely narrow strait. The problem was that both sides of this passage were guarded by two deadly entities. On the right stood the cliff of Scylla, a biological flesh-grinding machine with 6 heads specialized in snatching sailors directly from the deck. On the opposite side waited Charybdis, an enormous whirlpool, powerful enough to crush an entire fleet and drag it down to the muddy depths. The distance separating these two powers was only as wide-eyed as the flight of an arrow. It was a deadly bottleneck. The ship could not turn around within the violent current. The narrow passage allowed no margin for steering around the danger. Every escape route had been locked shut. Odysseus was forced to act as a merciless judge. He had to choose which side would kill fewer of his men. And the result was, this 6 men would die, but the rest would have a chance to survive. By contrast, if the ship drifted into the waters of Charybdis at the exact moment the whirlpool pulled downward, the entire fleet would be erased forever. Even the sea god Poseidon would be unable to raise them from the realm of death. This was the most brutal decision of Odysseus's entire military life. Yet trapped between Scylla and Charybdis, every trick, strategy, and act of heroic strength became useless. The idea of a complete victory had been removed. Odysseus was allowed to choose only the path that produced the least mourning in order to preserve the lives of the majority. Scylla, the 6-headed predatory machine. Circe's intelligence report described Scylla's lair as lying deep within a sheer cliff. The cave entrance opened toward the west and looked directly down upon the only navigable route through the strait. The cliff was so steep, slippery, and high that even the greatest archer could not shoot an arrow far enough to reach the edge of the cave. Scylla concealed most of her enormous body within the dark opening. From that perfect position, she extended her long necks into the open air and ambushed every living creature that passed below. Homer records the creature's anatomy in detail. 12 deformed legs clinging tightly to the cliff, 6 necks as long as enormous serpents, and at the end of each neck, a head equipped with 3 rows of razor-sharp teeth packed tightly together like the blades of a saw. This predator produced a shrill sound resembling the bark of a small dog, yet her killing power caused even the gods upon Mount Olympus to tremble. Scylla normally fed upon dolphins, seals, and monstrous fish. But a ship filled with human flesh moving close to the cliff was clearly a much easier feast. The structure of 6 heads allowed Scylla to identify and attack 6 separate targets at the same time. She never stepped out of her cave. The heads shot downward like spears seized the finest prey upon the deck and pulled the victims back toward the cliff. The entire cycle of killing from the moment the creature appeared until the prey disappeared unfolded at a speed beyond the ability of ordinary warriors to react. Later Greek artists frequently humanized Scylla. They portrayed her with the upper body of a woman, the lower body of a fish or sea serpent, and a pack of hunting dogs growing from her waist. Archaeological objects, such as a silver cup from the late 5th century before Christ, and numerous ceramic vessels from southern Italy depict a Scylla combining the forms of land and sea, gripping the broken rudder of a ship in her hand. Homer's original version, however, is far colder and more practical. He removes the female appearance and focuses entirely upon 6 blood-covered heads and 12 grotesque feet. To Homer, Scylla is simply a primitive predatory monster. The evolution of Scylla's origin across later literary periods also opens an interesting perspective. Homer identifies the monster's mother as Crataeis. Later writers added the theory that her father was the sea god Phorcys, or connected her bloodline with dark deities such as Typhon or Hecate. Only during the Roman age did the poet Ovid introduce the most dramatic version. Scylla had originally been a woman of extraordinary beauty. The sea god Glaucus became deeply infatuated with her and asked the sorceress Circe to prepare a love potion. Unfortunately, Circe herself fell in love with Glaucus. Consumed by violent jealousy, Circe poured a powerful poison into the pool, where Scylla bathed, transforming her into a sea monster that guarded the strait. Setting aside the differences in literary chronology, Circe's appearance within the origin story of Scylla once again confirms a disturbing consistency. Circe used drugs to transform sailors into pigs, and ancient tradition continued accusing her of using chemical substances to alter and hybridize the biological structure of a woman into a six-headed monster. In every age, Circe possesses the technology required to interfere with and distort the forms of living creatures. Charybdis, the entity that requires no physical form. Facing Scylla, the power known as Charybdis operates through a completely different physical mechanism. Homer shows no interest in describing the face teeth or limbs of this creature. He defines Charybdis through pure force, a supernatural suction beneath the sea located at the foot of a lower cliff, and marked by an enormous fig tree growing precariously above it. Its pattern of operation follows a deadly cycle. 3 times each day, it drains the surface of the sea. 3 times each day, it violently vomits all that water back out. When the suction mechanism is activated, the current is torn open deeply enough to reveal the black mud and sand upon the seabed. The force is powerful enough to shake every surrounding rock. When Charybdis disgorges the water, the sea explodes, foam boils violently, and spray rises as high as the summits of the 2 cliffs. Scylla selects her victims one by one. Charybdis swallows everything caught within the radius of the current. A sailor unfortunate enough to fall into Scylla's mouth is lost. Yet the ship remains intact, so the others can escape. But if Charybdis seizes the vessel, the whirlpool will drag the entire fleet, its wooden hull, food supplies, oars, and every member of the crew directly into the abyss. That is precisely why Circe's plan forced Odysseus to steer close to Scylla's cliff. 6 heads would cost only 6 human lives, but the whirlpool of Charybdis would bring an end to everyone. Carrying that sentence of life and death, Odysseus returned to the command deck. He clearly instructed the sailors concerning the use of beeswax to block the song of the Sirens, but he remained completely silent about the existence of Scylla. He knew with certainty that 6 of his men were about to be sent to the executioner, and he understood even more clearly that once this truth became known, psychological panic would destroy military discipline. The sailors would release their oars, hide inside the ship, or push one another toward the opposite side of the deck in an attempt to escape the cliff. A single, uncontrolled shift in the balance of the vessel would immediately send the entire fleet into the mouth of Charybdis. Faced with the question of survival, Odysseus issued a decisive command. He ordered the helmsman to hold the rudder straight and forced the rowers to use every remaining trace of strength to drive the ship forward. To reassure them, he restored the morale of his men by reminding them of their victory over the Cyclops, giving them confidence that they would overcome this passage as well. This was not an empty word of encouragement. It was a deliberate act of psychological manipulation. By fixing the sailors' thoughts upon earlier victories, he kept their hands moving in rhythm upon the oars and kept the ship traveling along the correct course. Yet the proud captain still chose to break Circe's rules in one detail. The sorceress had declared that Scylla was immortal. Physical weapons were useless. Remaining to fight would merely give the 6 heads enough time to descend for a second round of feeding. The only action that offered survival was escape. Despite this warning, Odysseus put on his complete armor, gripped 2 sharp spears, and stood firmly at the bow of the ship, staring toward the cliff. The warrior instinct within his blood forced him to search for a target to strike, regardless of logic. If you have ever driven across a narrow mountain pass beside an abyss during a stormy night, you understand the tension of keeping your eyes fixed upon the road. But the pressure upon Odysseus was 1,000 times more terrible. To the left, the surface of the sea was being pulled downward. To the right, the monster waited above them with its mouths open. Behind him, the lives of the entire company depended upon every order he gave. And the mind of Odysseus had to carry one brutal truth alone. 6 of his warriors were about to disappear from the journey forever. The moment the ship entered the strait, Charybdis began operating its machine of suction. The sea twisted and surged violently. Every member of the crew held his breath and directed 100% of his attention toward the deadly water preparing to swallow the fleet. That loss of focus opened the door for Scylla. From the darkness above, 6 necks shot outward like lightning. Each mouth seized one man. Odysseus turned around and froze when he saw 6 of his strongest and most physically powerful soldiers being lifted into the air. Their arms and legs kicked helplessly. They screamed the name of Odysseus one final time, begging their supreme commander to pull them back. Homer describes the scene through a cold image. It was like a fisherman swinging a long rod and lifting a group of struggling fish out of the water. Scylla pulled her long necks back toward the cave, carrying the 6 victims directly into the opening and devoured them before the helpless eyes of the survivors. Many years later, Odysseus admitted that this was the most heartbreaking scene he had ever witnessed throughout all his years of wandering upon the sea. That is the brutal weight of the throne of command. Odysseus had deliberately selected this route. He knew the required number of casualties in advance. The deaths of 6 men paid the toll that allowed the others to survive. Yet, the strategic correctness of that decision could never erase their screams from his mind. This is the point that completely separates Scylla and Charybdis from the earlier threats. Polyphemus was a problem solved through intelligence. Circe was a chemical trap defeated by an antidote. The Sirens were a psychological assault defended against with beeswax. But Scylla and Charybdis forced human beings to accept sacrifice. The highest form of wisdom at this point was no longer the ability to defeat every enemy. It was the ability to recognize limitations, accept the option involving the least bloodshed, and continue rowing forward over the bodies of companions. The real geographical scene behind the story. The trail of this crime leads directly to the Strait of Messina, a narrow strip of water cutting like a blade between the island of Sicily and the southern coast of Italy. Strabo, the great Greek geographer of the 1st century before Christ, mapped and described Charybdis as the extremely deep waters within the Strait of Messina. There, the constant collision of opposing currents produced enormous whirlpools that dragged ships beneath the surface and later cast fragments of wood onto the coast of Sicily. Modern hydrology confirms that the terror of this strait is real. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Messina is only about 3 kilometers wide. The Tyrrhenian Sea to the north and the Ionian Sea to the south push 2 bodies of tidal water moving out of phase with one another directly into collision. As those enormous bodies of water pass through the bottleneck, the current can reach a speed of up to 3 meters per second. The water tears across the surface, producing whirlpools, standing waves, and twisting forces powerful enough to disrupt every method of navigation. Even modern vessels equipped with powerful engines and satellite navigation systems must proceed with extreme caution through this location. A comprehensive record of the monsters at the edge of the world. If these monsters were preserved as real entities within Greek memory, then Homer successfully assembled a diverse record of an abnormal ecosystem within the ancient world. The surviving texts do not place Scylla within the same bloodline as the Nephilim. She resembles a mutated hybrid monster rather than a humanoid being. However, the strongest connection remains. The entire ancient world was covered by monstrous, gigantic, violent, and bloodthirsty races. Homer gives each power a completely distinct identity. The Cyclopes represent lawless superhuman physical strength. The Laestrygonians represent an organized cannibal society. The Sirens represent psychological manipulation and deadly temptation. Scylla represents the predatory machine striking from above. Charybdis represents the destructive black hole beneath the sea. This perfect classification demonstrates that beyond the faint light of civilization surrounding the Greek city-states, the outer boundaries of the ancient map belonged entirely to malevolent entities that hunted humanity. Odysseus paid the price of 6 human lives to pass through Scylla and Charybdis. Yet the final fatal blow would come from no gigantic monster. It would come from the very men sitting aboard his ship. Ahead of the fleet lay the island of Thrinacia, the grazing place of the sacred cattle of the sun god. Both the sorceress Circe and the prophet Tiresias in the underworld had delivered an unmistakable ultimatum. The cattle must never be touched, and the ship would then arrive safely in Ithaca. The sailors had all heard the warning clearly. They had sworn a solemn oath to obey it. But when the food supply ran out, when hunger tore through their stomachs, and when Odysseus finally closed his eyes and fell asleep from exhaustion, those soldiers made a brutal decision that brought the blade of death down upon everyone who remained. The cattle of Helios, the crew's final decision. 6 men had just been dragged from the deck by Scylla. Their screams were still echoing inside Odysseus's mind as the ship sailed away from the Strait. The survivors continued rowing forward, exhausted, starving, and grieving the loss of more close companions. Then, from offshore, they heard the bellowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep coming from an island. Odysseus immediately recognized the place. Thrinacia, the island of Helios, the god of the sun. The prophet Tiresias had warned him about this island when the two met in the world of the dead. Circe had also repeated the warning before the ship departed from Adaria. Both delivered the same message: leave the cattle untouched. The men would still have a chance to return to Ithaca. The killing of a single animal would bring about the destruction of the ship and the entire crew. Odysseus turned toward the men holding the oars and repeated every word of the warning. He wanted to sail directly past the island, even though everyone had just endured one of the most terrifying stages of the journey. But Eurylochus stood up in protest. He looked at the men around him. Their hands were covered in blisters. Their bodies were nearly drained of strength. 6 companions had just died before their eyes, and night was approaching. Eurylochus said that Odysseus possessed unusual endurance, while the rest of them were still human beings of flesh and blood. They needed food, sleep, and several hours upon solid ground before continuing their voyage. His words received the agreement of the entire crew. Odysseus understood that he had lost the ability to force them to continue rowing. He therefore agreed to land under one clear condition. Everyone had to swear an oath to leave the cattle of Helios untouched and consume only the provisions remaining aboard the ship. Every man agreed. The ship entered a small bay upon the island of Thrinacia. The livestock there possessed an unusual characteristic. Helios owned 7 herds of cattle and 7 flocks of sheep. Each herd and flock contained 50 animals. Their number always remained unchanged because they neither reproduced nor died. 2 goddesses, Phaethusa and Lamphiti, the daughters of Helios and the goddess Neaera, were responsible for caring for them. The animals were healthy, well-fed, and moved freely across the pastures. To the starving sailors, every cow looked like a meal that could keep them alive. But the warning remained unchanged. The first night passed peacefully. Everyone ate the food they had brought and rested beside the ship. The following morning, a powerful south wind began to blow. The wind pushed the ship toward the shore and held them upon the island. Thick clouds gathered. The sea remained turbulent. The men waited for the weather to change, but the wind continued blowing for many days. 1 week passed, then 2 weeks. In the end, they remained trapped upon Thrinacia for an entire month. The bread, wine, and dried meat aboard the ship gradually ran out. The sailors began walking along the shoreline, using hooks to catch fish and searching for birds to eat. Each day they obtained less food than their bodies required. Hunger began to change the entire crew. They watched the cattle moving across the pastures. They heard the sheep during the night. The oath remained, but their empty stomachs weakened their resolve with each passing day. Odysseus continued to keep his promise. One day, he left the camp and traveled deeper into the island in search of a quiet place to pray. He washed his hands, directed his plea toward the gods, and asked for a way to help the men escape from Thrinacia. Then, a deep sleep fell upon him. Eurylochus realized that Odysseus had left the camp. He gathered the remaining men and presented his final decision. Eurylochus said that every form of death was terrifying, but starvation brought the longest suffering. He proposed that they select the finest cattle of Helios, offer them as sacrifices, and then use the meat to survive the remaining days. He also promised that once they returned to Ithaca, they would build a great temple dedicated to Helios and place precious offerings inside it. The argument sounded reasonable to the exhausted men. They were about to starve to death. Food was walking directly before them. A ritual and a promise to build a temple appeared capable of turning the act into a fair exchange. The entire group agreed. They selected the finest cattle, drove them close to the ship, and began preparing the ceremony. The barley normally used for the sacrifice had been completely exhausted. They therefore gathered young leaves from an oak tree and used them as a substitute. The wine was also gone. They used water for the ceremonial pouring. The men spoke their prayers, killed the cattle, removed their hides, and cut away the thigh portions. They wrapped the bones in 2 layers of fat, placed raw meat over them, and burned them as an offering to the gods. Afterward, they roasted the internal organs over the fire. At that moment, strange signs began to appear. The hides that had been removed from the cattle crawled across the ground. The pieces of meat placed upon the spits began to bellow. The sounds came from both the raw meat and the meat being cooked. Everyone heard them, but hunger had already carried them too far to stop. Odysseus awoke and immediately smelled the roasting meat. He ran back toward the ship, but the sacrifice had already been completed. The remaining men had broken their oath. Odysseus immediately understood what was about to happen. Lampete saw that the cattle had been killed and immediately went to report the crime to her father. Helios became enraged. He appeared before Zeus and the other gods and demanded judgment against the crew of Odysseus. Helios said that the cattle brought him joy whenever he ascended into the sky and returned to the earth. If the men who had killed them were allowed to escape, he would abandon the heavens and shine instead within the world of the dead. Zeus answered with a promise. When the ship returned to sea, his lightning bolt would break it apart in the middle of the ocean. During the following 6 days, the sailors continued eating the cattle. Each meal restored some of their strength. The weather continued holding the ship upon the island. Some of the men may have begun to believe that the warning would never become reality. On the 7th day, the south wind stopped. A new wind began blowing toward the sea. The sailors hurriedly gathered their belongings, boarded the ship, and raised the sail. They departed from Thrinacia with the hope of continuing their journey home. At first, the island gradually became smaller behind them. Then, Zeus drew a black cloud over the ship. The surface of the sea darkened. A violent west wind began to blow. The ropes holding the mast snapped. The mast fell backward, struck the helmsman, and crushed his skull. The man's body fell from the deck into the sea. Immediately afterward, Zeus hurled a lightning bolt into the center of the ship. The wood exploded apart. The smell of sulfur spread across the deck. The entire ship spun among the enormous waves, and the sailors were thrown into the water. Homer describes them floating around the wreckage like seabirds. One by one, they disappeared beneath the waves. Eurylochus also died within the storm that his own decision had summoned. The men who had survived the Cyclops, the Laestrygonians, Circe, the Sirens, and Scylla now vanished together with everyone who remained. Only Odysseus managed to cling to part of the wreckage. The ship had broken into many pieces. He seized the mast and the keel, then used straps made of oxide to bind them together into a temporary raft. The wind continued pushing him back along the route he had just traveled. At that moment, Odysseus realized that he was drifting back toward Charybdis. The whirlpool that had once threatened the entire ship was now waiting for a single man. When Charybdis began drawing in the water, the raft was pulled directly toward the mouth of the whirlpool. Odysseus saw the great fig tree growing above the cliff exactly as Circe had described. He leapt from the raft, seized a branch, and suspended himself above the whirlpool. Below him, Charybdis swallowed both the mast and the keel. Odysseus clung to the fig branch, his legs hanging over empty space. He had nowhere to place his feet and could not climb onto the trunk. His body possessed only enough strength to hold tightly to the branch and wait. Time passed, At last, Charybdis expelled the water again. The mast and keel rose out of the whirlpool. Odysseus released the branch, fell directly beside the pieces of wood, climbed onto them, and used his hands to paddle away from the dangerous waters. Scylla was also nearby, but the gods kept her inside the cave, allowing Odysseus to escape from the strait for a second time. He continued drifting alone for 9 days. On the 10th night, the current carried him to the island of Ogygia, where the goddess Calypso lived. The journey had begun with 12 ships. Now only one man remained clinging to pieces of wood. Odysseus had seen the Cyclopes, the city of the Laestrygonians, the arts of Circe, the song of the Sirens, and the 6 heads of Scylla. But his crew died because of a decision made under the pressure of hunger. Tiresias had foretold it. Circe had repeated it. Odysseus had delivered the warning. Everyone had sworn an oath. And upon Thrinacia, Eurylochus and the remaining men chose the cattle standing before them instead of the warning about the consequences ahead. Homer places this event within the opening lines of the Odyssey. He says that Odysseus tried to save his companions, but they brought death upon themselves when they ate the cattle of Helios. This is the end of the entire crew. From this point forward, only Odysseus remains, a man who has lost every companion, every ship, and everything he carried away from Troy. Ahead of him lies 7 years upon the island of Calypso. But before following Odysseus to that place, we need to look back upon the entire journey that has just unfolded. Because the Cyclops, the Laestrygonians, Circe, the Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis together form a much greater record. A record that may reveal Homer preserving the memory of an ancient world that once existed after the Great Flood. Cyclopes, Laestrygonians, Circe, Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis. When these names are placed beside one another, they cease to be random monsters encountered along a journey. They form a complete ecosystem. A large-scale intelligence record reveals the truth Homer was deliberately preserving a map of an ancient world that once existed immediately after the age of the Great Flood. However, among all the entities, Odysseus encountered the power of the giants, left behind the bloodiest and most tangible evidence. The tyrant Polyphemus chewed the bones of some of the finest soldiers inside his dark cave. The empire of King Antiphates and the Laestrygonian people crushed 11 warships and hundreds of sailors within a single twilight afternoon. These 2 massacres wiped out nearly the entire force of Odysseus. And this destruction brings us back to the central question lying at the heart of tonight's entire investigation. Were Homer's giants truly descendants of the Nephilim? Look at this brutal reality. Odysseus departed from Troy with 12 powerful warships and hundreds of battle-hardened warriors. By the end of the journey, he was the only man still breathing. To understand that horrifying destruction, we must reopen the records from 2 deadly locations, the cave of Polyphemus and the city of the Laestrygonians. At the first scene, Odysseus confronts an isolated giant who lives according to savage instinct. At the second scene, he collides with an entire empire of giants, possessing a king, a queen houses, and a complete social structure. What is the single point connecting these 2 worlds? Their physical size extends far beyond the biological limits of humanity, and they regard human beings as livestock raised for food. Most importantly, both populations exist firmly within lands lying beyond the reach of civilization established by the Greek city-states. Polyphemus, the first individual in the criminal record. Odysseus encounters Polyphemus after leading 12 soldiers into an enormous coastal cave. The scene inside provides clear sociological evidence. There are lambs, young goats, baskets of cheese, and enormous containers filled with fresh milk. The owner of this cave possesses advanced knowledge of animal husbandry, understands how to preserve stored food, and maintains an extremely precise biological routine. But when Polyphemus appears, his true size shatters every standard. He carries an enormous bundle of firewood upon his shoulder, and when he throws it down, the impact is powerful enough to shake the entire structure of the cave. He uses a gigantic boulder as a door. Homer clearly states that the combined pulling power of 20 of the strongest wagons on Earth would be helpless before that stone. Yet Polyphemus lifts it himself and places it perfectly into the entrance with only one hand. His walking staff is as large as the mast of an enormous cargo vessel. And when Odysseus desperately attempts to escape toward the sea, the enraged Polyphemus breaks away an entire section of the mountain and hurls it through the air. The rock crashes into the ocean and creates a wave powerful enough to drive the ship back toward the shore. Homer defines the race of the Cyclopes through two words: arrogant and lawless. They live scattered throughout volcanic caves. Each male establishes complete tyranny over his own family and holds the very idea of community in contempt. Polyphemus himself is compared to a mountain peak covered in forest, standing isolated and grotesquely separate from everything else in the world. But his mutated body is only the outer shell. The true crime lies within his mind. When Odysseus appeals to the sacred law of hospitality and asks for protection, Polyphemus openly declares that the Cyclopes stand above Zeus. His personal will is the only law possessing authority inside the cave. In the next moment, he seizes two soldiers, smashes their skulls against the stone floor, and devours them alive. The following morning, he repeats the process with two more men. Polyphemus can reason, he can communicate, he can develop plans. He questions Odysseus about the location of the ship in order to permanently cut off his prey's escape route. He displays a sick sense of humor when he promises to eat Odysseus last as a special privilege. This is absolutely not a wild animal. This is an intelligent being operating a systematic method of hunting human beings, and Homer does not conceal the genealogy of this creature. Polyphemus is the offspring produced through the union of the sea god Poseidon and the goddess Thoosa. From the very beginning, his origin involves intervention from the supernatural world. The Book of Enoch and the perfect comparison. Now, open the Book of Enoch. This text clearly records the fallen angels, known as the Watchers, taking mortal women and producing a race of giants. During the first stage, these monstrous creatures exhausted every food source cultivated by humanity. When the agricultural system collapsed and could no longer provide enough food to fill their stomachs, they immediately changed their diet. They began eating human beings. When humanity was depleted, they slaughtered animals, tore one another apart, and drank the blood of their own kind. Now compare this with Polyphemus. He operates according to the same pattern. He owns an enormous flock of livestock and possesses an abundant supply of food inside his cave. He is not hungry. Yet the moment he smells human beings, he immediately reduces them to food. Both records, the Greek and the Jewish, define the hunger of the giants as something arising beyond the need for survival. It is a violent appetite that breaks every natural order. The giants steal what human beings produce. Then they eat the human beings themselves. The Book of Enoch identifies the Nephilim as lawless. Homer uses precisely the same term to condemn the Cyclopes, a race that worships individual violence, despises the law, and tramples every higher authority beneath its feet. The record of Polyphemus corresponds perfectly with four central characteristics of the Nephilim: superior physical power, a supernatural hybrid bloodline, a lawless nature that recognizes no authority, an appetite for human flesh. The only detail separating the two texts is the single eye of Polyphemus. Genesis and Enoch do not mention this physical abnormality. However, it is merely a localized Greek identifying feature that serves the eye-blinding event within the epic. The other four core characteristics provide the iron evidence connecting Polyphemus with the worldwide system of giant traditions. The Laestrygonians, from a single murderer to a cannibal empire. Had the Odyssey ended its record of giants with Polyphemus, scholars would have possessed the right to dismiss him as an isolated mutation. But that possibility was torn apart when Odysseus entered the kingdom of the Laestrygonians. This time, the giants no longer hide inside dark caves. they rule an entire metropolis. They possess an advanced system for transporting timber operate, a shared water network, construct houses and public squares, and live under the authority of a king, a queen, and a royal household. When the three scouts sent by Odysseus enter the palace of King Antiphates, they encounter a queen whose body is as enormous as a towering mountain. She summons her husband. The moment King Antiphates enters through the doorway, he seizes one of the scouts and devours him upon the spot. The other two flee toward the harbor in terror. Antiphates declares the highest state of alarm. His roar summons the entire Laestrygonian population. Homer describes thousands of giants thundering in from every road, their appearance resembling monstrous divine beings more than ordinary humans. They stand upon the cliffs surrounding the harbor and unleash a rain of massive rocks that crushes the fleet. They then use enormous spears to pierce the bodies of sailors swimming through the water, exactly like fishermen spearing fish. After the slaughter, they string together the blood-covered bodies and carry them back to the city for a feast. 11 Greek warships are destroyed in an instant. Odysseus survives only because he cautiously anchored his single vessel outside the edge of the harbor entrance. This brutal event permanently changes the structure of the investigation. Polyphemus represents the criminal psychology of an individual. The Laestrygonians demonstrate the existence of state-sponsored terror. The hunting of human beings has been systematized into the shared behavior of an entire nation. The king begins the feast within his palace. The population performs a collective massacre at the harbor, and the city continues its ordinary civil activities immediately before and after the slaughter. Homer preserves two completely independent ecological models of giant society: the scattered and savage nomadic model of the Cyclopes and the militarized state model of the Laestrygonians. The single chain binding these two models together consists of their immense-sized destructive strength and treatment of human beings as a source of protein. The Bible contains more than one Nephilim bloodline. Now compare this evidence with the Bible. Genesis chapter 6 delivers a final statement concerning the Nephilim in those days and also afterward. This sentence confirms that the existence of giants was not confined to a single moment in history. Many centuries after the flood, when Moses sent 12 spies into the land of Canaan, they returned with a terrifying report. At the city of Hebron, they encountered the sons of Anak beings, identified as direct descendants of the Nephilim. The spies reported that before them they appeared to be nothing more than grasshoppers. Throughout the later books of the Old Testament, names such as the Anakim and the Rephaim continually appear. They are not wandering individuals. They are giant nations possessing vast territories and powerful systems of government. King Og of Bashan is described as the last remnant of the Rephaim. Deuteronomy provides the exact physical measurements of the iron bed belonging to this king, 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, equivalent to more than 4 meters in length and nearly 2 meters in width. The key to understanding the record lies in the way the Bible classifies them. The Anakim are a people. The Rephaim are a bloodline. Og is a king ruling over a kingdom. The post-flood giants of the Bible established strongholds, armies, territories, and social structures. Homer's kingdom of the Laestrygonians possesses precisely the same elements: a city, rulers, and a population. This intersection pushes the story beyond the boundaries of cheap mythology. Both Greek civilization and the Hebrew tradition preserve the same fragment of historical memory: the existence of organized giant empires possessing enough physical strength to crush human armies. 2 languages, 1 truth. Homer calls the one-eyed predator a Cyclops. He calls the cannibal empire the Laestrygonians. The Hebrew Bible calls them Nephilim, Anakim, and Rephaim. The names change according to the language, geographical frame of reference, and psychological trauma of each people. Homer places Polyphemus upon a remote island somewhere beyond the Mediterranean. The Bible places the Anakim in Canaan and the Rephaim in Bashan within the Near East. Their supernatural origins are also localized. Polyphemus carries the blood of the sea god Poseidon within Greek mythology. The Nephilim are the descendants of the fallen angels, known as the Watchers within Jewish theology. The two cultural systems possess completely different ways of explaining the divine world, yet their criminal profiles are perfect copies of one another. A biological structure exceeding human dimensions, overwhelming physical strength, a collective that maintains power through bloody violence, an arrogant attitude that tramples upon the law. And in both the Book of Enoch and the Odyssey, they openly place human flesh within their food chain, the testimony of a living witness. Homer does not approach the scene from the perspective of a historian sitting at a desk and recording rumors. He gives the authority of narration to a living witness, Odysseus. This king personally enters the cave of Polyphemus. His own eyes witness his companions having their skulls crushed and their bodies devoured alive. He personally serves the wine blinds the monster's eye and clings beneath the sheep in order to escape. He is the man who leads the fleet into the territory of the Laestrygonians. He sends the scouts to investigate. He stands helplessly and watches 11 warships being shattered beneath a rain of stones. And he personally cuts the mooring rope and screams at the remaining men to row for their lives toward the open sea. The perspective of the Odyssey is the perspective of a victim reporting the scene. Place names may have been distorted across generations of oral tradition. Physical dimensions may have been exaggerated. Magical details may have been added to heighten the epic quality. But the sequence of ecological behavior cannot easily be fabricated. The giants live inside caves. They raise livestock. They use language to communicate. They establish families and nations. And they eat human beings. That is why Homer's record cannot be dismissed. He does not describe invisible ghosts. He portrays entities possessing daily routines, patterns of habitation, and social structures. The Cyclopes and the Laestrygonians function like actual peoples within the ancient world, rather than shadows created by a nightmare. The final conclusion were they Nephilim. An analysis of the textual evidence leads us toward a conclusion consisting of two layers. The surface layer is academic. Homer never uses the name Nephilim. The Odyssey does not provide a genealogy connecting the Cyclopes or the Laestrygonians with the Watchers of the Book of Enoch. Therefore, it is impossible to prove in explicit written terms that the Cyclops were precisely the Nephilim. But the deeper layer of truth carries devastating weight. Polyphemus and the Laestrygonian people carry 100% of the DNA code belonging to the Hebrew giant tradition. They possess bodies and strength that violate ordinary biological limits. They carry bloodlines shaped by supernatural intervention. They live above morality. They rule through violence. They consume human beings. And they exist both as isolated individuals like the Nephilim and as organized nations, exactly like the Anakim and the Rephaim. The most convincing conclusion of this investigation is therefore this: Homer's giants and the Nephilim of the Hebrew world belong to the same historical lineage. They represent humanity's shared memory of a generation of monsters that once dominated the ancient world. The Greeks sealed that memory beneath the names Polyphemus and the Laestrygonians. The Hebrews carved that memory beneath the names Nephilim, Anakim, and Rephaim. Each civilization packaged the story within its own language, geography, and religion. Yet their genetic code of criminal behavior is impossible to confuse. Polyphemus may not carry an identification card bearing the name Nephilim within Homer's work. Yet every one of his actions is the action of a true Nephilim emerging directly from the Book of Enoch. The Laestrygonians may not be called Rephaim, yet they operate exactly like a Rephaim nation. They possess a king, an army, and enough power to destroy a human fleet. It is entirely possible that Homer fulfilled the mission of preserving an enormous archive of the post-flood world, a world in which giant bloodlines continued stubbornly clinging to the outer edges of the map. Some hid within dark caves, others constructed vast cities, and all of them planted a terrifying obsession within the blood of the small human beings unfortunate enough to encounter them. If this interpretation is correct, the Odyssey is far greater than a maritime adventure story. Odysseus is carrying out the task of redrawing the map of a lost world. A world of giants, forbidden sorcery, and malevolent entities that many empires across the earth continued remembering together. Therefore, the final question tonight is not, did Homer simply imagine the giants? The truly piercing question is this: how much blood-soaked historical truth did Homer encode before those truths were covered by the outer clothing of mythology? And were Polyphemus and the Laestrygonians the final Greek names used to identify the brutal bloodline of the Nephilim? Thrinacia, the sacred cattle of the sun god, and the tragedy of the crew. From the very first lines of the Odyssey, Homer lays the final card. Face up on the table, the entire fleet of Odysseus was completely destroyed. Look back at what they survived. They survived the slaughterhouse of the Trojan War. They escaped the jaws of the giant Cyclops. They fled from the cannibal empire of the Laestrygonians. They neutralized the magic of Circe. They survived the auditory hallucinations of the Sirens and paid with 6 human lives to pass through the deadly curve guarded by Scylla. They defeated every one of those supernatural killing machines, only for all of them to die in the end, because they ate from a herd of cattle. Homer throws that ironic conclusion directly into the faces of his audience, and only then calmly reopens every page of the record to reveal where the tragedy began. The first absolute prohibition was issued from the realm of the dead. When Odysseus descended into the underworld, the prophet Tiresias provided him with a life or death intelligence report. Tiresias warned that the sea god Poseidon was still hunting them to avenge his son Polyphemus. Even so, they still possessed an opportunity for complete survival, and the key to that opportunity lay upon the island of Thrinacia. Tiresias declared that the cattle and sheep of Helios grazed upon that island. Helios was the god of the sun, an entity who saw and heard every action taking place upon the earth. The mission of Odysseus was extremely simple: maintain discipline and bind the hands of his crew away from those animals. If the livestock remained unharmed, the entire fleet would reach its homeland safely. But if a single drop of their blood was spilled, the fleet would vanish. Tiresias added another cold sentence: Odysseus would survive, but he would return late, embittered, and in complete solitude. The sorceress Circe later added sharper resolution to this intelligence report. Upon the island of Thrinacia were precisely 7 herds of cattle and 7 flocks of sheep. Each herd and flock was limited to exactly 50 animals. The complete property of Helios upon the island therefore consisted of 350 cattle and 350 sheep. This was not ordinary biology. The number had been permanently sealed. They produced no offspring, and they never grew old or died. 2 goddesses, Phaethusa and Lampeie, the daughters of Helios, personally supervised the scene. Circe concluded her order with unmistakable force: close your eyes, steer past the island, and race directly home. Every violation would be paid for with human life. The captain entered this stage of the journey with a survival map that could not have been clearer. He knew the location of the island. He knew who owned the livestock. He knew the condition required to preserve their lives. And he fully understood the destructive consequences of breaking the rules. After escaping the deadly passage of Scylla and Charybdis, the ship slowly drifted towards Thrinacia. From offshore, Odysseus clearly heard the bellowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep echoing from the land. The warning system inside his mind activated immediately. He gathered the crew, revealed the entire secret intelligence report, and ordered the rowers to exhaust every trace of their strength and drive the ship directly past the island. But Odysseus had overlooked one fatal factor: the limits of human psychological endurance. The soldiers upon the deck had just watched 6 of their brothers being torn apart by a monster. Their arms had become numb after tearing through the surface of the sea to escape the whirlpool. Their stomachs were empty, and their spirits had reached the lowest point of exhaustion. They needed solid ground, they needed fire, and they needed sleep. At that moment, Eurymachus stood up as the defense attorney for the exhaustion of the entire crew. He turned his argument against Odysseus, claiming that the captain had been forged from iron and steel, while his sailors remained human beings of flesh and blood. Night was descending, and stubbornly sailing into the Black Ocean would amount to suicide if a storm arrived. Eurylochus proposed a compromise. They would land, where prepare food sleep for one night to recover and depart as soon as dawn appeared. The entire crew roared its agreement. Odysseus immediately realized that he had lost control of the crowd. He could not force a mutant's crew to row with their bare hands. He agreed to compromise, but demanded the establishment of a legal barrier. He forced every soldier to swear a sacred oath. Under no circumstances were they permitted to touch even a single hair belonging to the sacred livestock. They could consume only the dried provisions Circe had supplied. Everyone swore the oath together. The ship entered a sheltered bay. They pulled the wooden hull onto the sand, lit a fire, and fell asleep. At that moment, the decision appeared to be a reasonable move. The warning had been communicated. The oath had been sealed. Food still remained inside the supply stores. But when the sun rose, nature's trap finally closed. A violent wind suddenly rose from the south and continued blowing without rest, pinning the ship against the shore. Black clouds locked the sky shut. White-crested waves completely blocked their path back into the ocean. The fleet had officially become imprisoned. Day followed day. The supply of bread, dried meat, and wine gradually diminished until it finally reached the bottom. When the final calories were gone, the instinct for survival awakened. The proud warriors of Troy were forced to carry fishing hooks along the shoreline, hunt birds, catch fish, and dig for anything they could force into their stomachs. That miserable supply of nourishment was barely enough to prolong their agony. And the most brutal form of psychological torture was this. Hundreds of the fat cattle of Helios continued grazing peacefully directly before their eyes. For an entire month, the south wind continued enforcing their imprisonment. Odysseus gritted his teeth and remained faithful to the oath. He understood the law of exchange. Hunger was temporary physical suffering, while touching the cattle would bring a certain death sentence. But the crisis began when Odysseus made a tactical mistake. He separated himself from the group. He traveled deep into the interior of the island, found a place sheltered from the wind, washed his hands, and prayed for the gods to open an escape route for the fleet. At that very moment, a supernatural power cast a deep, unconscious sleep over his mind. He was completely neutralized and entirely separated from the scene surrounding the ship. With their leader gone, Eurylochus immediately seized control. This time, he introduced an argument of psychological manipulation that was almost impossible to resist. Eurylochus declared that every form of death was terrible, but starvation was the most humiliating and miserable death possible for a warrior. He proposed a plan to bend the law, capture the fattest cattle, perform a sacrificial ceremony for the gods, and then use the meat to survive. To purchase the favor of the divine powers, Eurylochus promised that once they reached Ithaca, they would construct an enormous temple filled with gold and silver as compensation for Helios. The argument drove directly into the minds of soldiers who were becoming insane from hunger. They were slowly dying. Food was walking directly before them. The captain was absent, and Eurylochus had successfully covered a criminal act with the clothing of a religious ceremony in order to make it appear legitimate. The group immediately agreed. They rushed toward the livestock and brought down the finest bulls. The text clearly records that they did not slaughter all 350 cattle. They killed only enough to feed themselves for 6 days, a desperate attempt to place limits around the crime. Because the sacrificial barley had been exhausted, they tore young leaves from an oak tree and used them as a substitute. They cut the throats of the cattle, removed their hides, separated the thigh portions, covered them with 2 thick layers of fat, and placed raw meat on top. With no wine remaining, they poured brackish water over the offerings and set them on fire. The remaining lean meat was placed upon spits for roasting. But the oath shattered the moment the first blade cut through the throat of a bull. Immediately, the crime scene transformed into a spiritual horror story. Supernatural signs erupted. The cattle hides that had just been removed began crawling across the ground by themselves. The pieces of raw meat and the meat roasting upon the spits began producing deep bellows, exactly like living cattle. Every soldier standing around the fire heard those grotesque sounds with his own ears, but hunger had erased their fear. They continued sinking their teeth into the meat. Deep within the forest, Odysseus suddenly awoke. The smell of roasting meat struck directly into his nostrils. He ran wildly toward the beach. The closer he came, the stronger the stench of burning fat became. His analytical mind had already reached its verdict before his eyes saw the traders sitting around the fire and chewing the meat. He raised his face toward the sky and condemned the gods for striking him with sleep during the most critical moment. But everything had already been decided. The cattle were dead, the false ritual had been completed, and the violation was complete. Meanwhile, within the higher structure of the universe, the criminal report traveled at the speed of light. The goddess Lampeti witnessed the scene and immediately reported it to her father. Helios appeared in fury before the Supreme Court of Olympus and threw his accusation directly before Zeus. He charged the corrupt sailors of Odysseus with slaughtering his sacred livestock, the unique source of his joy whenever he drove the chariot of the sun across the sky. Helios delivered an ultimatum: blood must be repaid with blood. If Zeus refused to execute them, Helios would abandon the heavens and take the sun directly into the underworld to shine upon the dead, leaving the earth to sink into eternal darkness. Driven into a corner, Zeus issued his judgment. Helios must remain in his position, and Zeus himself would use lightning to tear the ship apart the moment it appeared upon the open ocean. Below upon the earth, Odysseus was completely powerless. The wind continued imprisoning them. The food had already been prepared. The crew frantically filled their stomachs with beef for 6 consecutive days. Every piece of meat they swallowed restored their muscles while moving them another step toward the execution machine that had already been armed. On the 7th day, the trap closed. The weather suddenly changed. The south wind died completely and was replaced by a perfectly favorable wind that opened the way out of Thrinacia. The soldiers cheered, struggled to push the ship back into the water and raise the mast. After 1 month of captivity, they believed they had deceived both nature and the gods. The coast of Thrinacia gradually became smaller and then disappeared from sight. At the exact moment the island vanished beneath the horizon, Zeus pulled the trigger. An enormous mass of black clouds was violently dragged across the sky and covered the ship. The air became as dark as the bottom of a grave. A western storm exploded and struck directly against the sail, forcing the vessel to tilt beneath a physically destructive pressure. The ropes securing the mast burst like gunfire. The solid wooden mast collapsed backward and struck the helmsman directly upon the head. The force crushed his skull and threw his body into the depths of the sea. 1 second later, Zeus released a lightning bolt carrying destructive energy and split the ship in 2. Blinding light arrived with an ear-shattering explosion. The enormous mass of wood spun among towering waves, pouring out smoke and filling the air with the choking smell of sulfur. The shock wave threw every sailor from the deck and scattered them into the sea. Homer describes them floating and rising among the wreckage like a flock of drowned seabirds. One by one, the waves swallowed them. Eurylochus, the mastermind behind the rebellion, also died beside those who had accepted his argument. Every proud warrior who had shattered Troy escaped the grasp of Polyphemus, passed through the rain of stones unleashed by the Laestrygonians, and outmaneuvered the Sirens, was completely erased within a single storm. This destruction was no accident. It was the result of a sequence of events that had been foretold. Tiresias delivered the report. Circe gave the instructions. Odysseus communicated the warning. The oath was sworn. The destruction at Thrinacia was the full price for trampling upon the contract of survival. Odysseus was the only person aboard the ship whose mouth remained clean. When the lightning tore the ship apart, he clung tightly to a floating piece of wood. The waves stripped the hull apart and broke the mast from its base. Through his extraordinary survival skills, Odysseus found a strap made from oxhide and tightly bound the mast to the keel of the ship, creating an emergency raft. He climbed onto it and surrendered his life to the current. But nature had not finished with him. The wind changed direction and cruelly pushed the raft back toward the very black hole from which he had just escaped, the Strait of Scylla in Charybdis. When Charybdis began drawing in the water, the raft was pulled directly into the throat of the whirlpool. With an iron reflex, Odysseus saw the enormous fig tree extending from the cliff. He threw himself into the air, seized one of its branches, and hung suspended above the abyss. Directly beneath him, Charybdis swallowed the raft. Odysseus gritted his teeth and remained hanging there like a desperate bat, patiently counting the time until the whirlpool completed its cycle and vomited the broken wood back onto the surface. The moment the mast appeared, he released his grip, dropped into the water, climbed back onto the raft, and used his bare hands to paddle furiously away from the deadly location. Scylla remained inside her cave and missed her prey. Odysseus passed through the strait for a second time and drifted alone without food or water for 9 full days. On the 10th night, the waves carried his battered body onto the sands of Ogygia, the domain of the goddess Calypso. This report provides a sharp explanation for the image of a king who had lost his kingdom. He departed from Troy as the supreme commander of a fleet. The Cyclopes chewed the bones of one group. The Laestrygonians crushed 11 ships. Scylla seized 6 of his finest men, and Thrinacia finished everyone who remained. During the earlier stages, Odysseus had been forced to match his intelligence against monsters and supernatural entities existing beyond the authority of human law. But at the final point of destruction, the one who sent the entire fleet into the grave was Eurylochus himself, the trusted right hand who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Odysseus through every hell. Eurylochus knew the law. He had sworn the oath. But when hunger placed him under pressure, he chose to bend the law, manufacture a false religious justification, and pull the entire group into the abyss of destruction. This was the most brutal turning point, and the event that closed the record of the crew. When Odysseus opens his eyes upon the beach in the next part of the story, he possesses nothing except bleeding memories of those who have fallen. The warships have vanished. The army has been destroyed. Every treasure taken from Troy now lies at the bottom of the sea. Only one man remains alive, carrying upon his shoulders the burden of a living witness, the man appointed to explain why none of his brothers would ever again receive the opportunity to see their homeland. Odysseus, the only living witness to an era that was erased. Let us turn back to the opening pages of the record. Odysseus sailed away from the ashes of Troy in a position of pride, a supreme commander holding 12 warships, and hundreds of veterans hardened by 10 years of blood and fire. Yet, the wheel of fate crushed everything. When the cold current threw his battered shoulders onto the sands of Ogygia, that entire undefeated army had vanished without leaving behind even a single plank. Look directly at their brutal chain of casualties, and you will see a perfectly orchestrated scenario of destruction. The opening shot was fired inside the dark cave, where the giant Polyphemus devoured the first group of scouts alive and shattered every illusion of safety. Immediately afterward, the tyrannical empire of the Laestrygonians delivered the devastating blow, grinding 11 ships into sawdust within a single twilight afternoon. The few survivors who slipped through the net were then attacked by the monster Scylla, who extended her long necks and snatched 6 of the finest rowers from the deck. The final gate slammed shut when the lightning bolt of Zeus's judgment burned away every remaining traitor immediately after the slaughter of the sacred cattle upon the island of Thrinacia. After drifting helplessly upon a broken piece of wood for 9 days and 9 nights, Odysseus experienced the absolute depths of solitude before the waves cast him ashore. The king of Ithaca now possessed nothing. No warship, no weapon, no treasure taken from Troy. And absolutely none of the brothers who had shared life and death with him remained breathing at his side. The man who had once stood at the height of power and roared commands over a great fleet had now become the sole living witness to the entire blood-soaked journey. Every piece of evidence concerning Polyphemus, the Laestrygonians, the Sirens, and the monster Scylla, all of it was exclusively sealed inside a single black box, the memory of Odysseus. And it is this naked and bleeding testimony that draws us directly back to the greatest question of all, a question rooted in the pool of blood inside the Cyclops' cave. Were Homer's giants truly the Nephilim? Researchers of ancient texts will almost certainly never discover a handwritten genealogy directly connecting the DNA of Polyphemus with the Nephilim. Homer defines this Cyclops as the offspring of the sea god Poseidon, while Hebrew tradition identifies the Nephilim as hybrids produced by the union of the fallen angels and mortal women. This difference is obvious because the two cultures were using completely different religious lenses to encode the same historical phenomenon. But when we strip away the divine outer covering and examine the core crime scene, the correspondence becomes so disturbing that it is impossible to deny. The criminal record of Polyphemus contains the following evidence: an enormous skeletal structure that violates biological law, physical strength capable of crushing humanity, a supernatural bloodline, a nature that tramples every form of law, and above all, a bottomless appetite for human flesh. The Laestrygonian Empire reproduces that same demonic genetic code with exact precision. Yet it becomes 10,000 times more dangerous after expanding into a militarized nation possessing rulers, a social hierarchy, and fortified cities. Place this record beside the Book of Enoch. You will see that the giants produced by the Watchers operate according to the same formula. They sweep across the land, exhaust every agricultural resource, and then turn directly toward slaughtering humanity for food. The Old Testament continues to establish the Anakim and the Rephaim as giant kingdoms that controlled parts of the world after the catastrophe of the flood. This body of evidence confirms a sharp truth. Polyphemus and the Laestrygonians are the surviving remnants of a historical memory concerning real giant races that once existed upon the earth. The Greeks sealed that terrifying memory beneath the names Cyclopes and Laestrygonians. The Hebrews preserved it through the names Nephilim, Anakim, and Rephaim. The names changed. The geographical locations shifted. The explanation of their origins was also adapted to match the religious system of each region. Yet their criminal core could never be confused with anything else. A mutated body, a supernatural bloodline, tyrannical strength, and a persistent treatment of human beings as the main course upon the table. Was Homer telling a fairy tale or recording historical memory? This is the decisive point upon which the credibility of the entire investigation depends. Homer skillfully wove gods, sorceresses, and monsters into his work, but he placed them upon a completely real ecological map. This was a world of warships, prosperous harbors, burning cities, and harsh seas where experienced sailors were forced to gamble their lives against the forces of nature. Odysseus walked through that chaotic world upon the bleeding feet of a mortal human being, never as an immortal god. He experienced hunger tearing through his stomach. He understood terror so extreme that it produced paralysis. He personally made fatal mistakes. When he was forced to stand helplessly and watch his brothers being torn apart, he possessed nothing beyond exhaustion and the desperate determination to drag his broken body home to his wife and family in Ithaca. These harsh, ordinary, and naked psychological wounds provide the strongest evidence that the Odyssey was never merely a work of fantasy created for entertainment. It was a real survival record, encoded through oral tradition and carefully preserved across countless generations. Within the oral traditions of ancient peoples, the most essential details were secured by invisible linguistic locks. They passed down the name of the great hero, They preserve the memory of a city besieged for 10 years. They engrave deeply into the mind the image of deadly harbors and islands inhabited by strange peoples. They remembered the whirlpools that once swallowed entire fleets, and they never forgot the immense stature of a giant tribe that slaughtered strangers. The passage of thousands of years could shift a location by several degrees of latitude or enlarge a monster by several feet. A tyrannical king could easily be elevated by folklore into a son of Poseidon, while a violent and twisting current could be personified as the monster Charybdis. No matter how many forms the outer language assumes, the core of the event remains deeply rooted within historical truth. The archaeology of Troy is the unbreakable iron evidence protecting this principle. For centuries, the intellectual elite mocked Troy as nothing more than a fictional setting, a theatrical stage within Homer's poetry. But by the 19th century, every prejudice had been shattered. Excavations at the mound of Hisarlik in Turkey tore open the earth and revealed an entire system of great cities constructed one above another across 4,000 years. Enormous defensive walls emerged into the sunlight and delivered a brutal truth to the skeptics: Bronze Age Troy truly existed. Although modern scholars continue attempting to separate the archaeological city from the romantic details of poetry, the mound of Hisarlik permanently placed an official seal upon one conclusion. The core of Homer's epic is rooted in real history. The kingdom of Mycenae is no exception within this chain of evidence. Massive defensive walls, imposing gates, monumental tombs and palaces belonging to the Mycenaean civilization still stand proudly upon Greek soil today. Their powerful territory once extended across the eastern Mediterranean, corresponding closely with the scale of authority and influence attributed to the heroes of Homer's epics. The immediate lesson is extremely sharp. The fact that an event has been clothed in the brilliant garments of mythology does not mean it is false. Stories colored by gods and magic have always existed alongside real geography, real city-states, and blood-soaked events within human history. Homer did not sit inside a study and record dry historical material like a modern researcher. He carried a greater mission to become a timeless archive of social memory. Discovering the stones of Troy does not automatically transform every line of his poetry into a real-time news report. But it does bring down a sledgehammer upon the rigid assumptions of later generations. When a city from poetry reveals its ruins beneath the earth, when the kingdoms of heroes leave behind swords and tombs, and when the current straits and isolated islands genuinely exist within the environment of ancient navigation, why should we arrogantly dismiss the existence of giants? Those enormous entities emerged from a blood-soaked collective memory of giant and warlike tribes that once dominated the wild frontiers of the world. The Greeks and the Hebrews breathed the same air during a distant age when groups of giants still wandered and trampled across the Near East and the Mediterranean. Homer used his native language to call them Polyphemus and the Laestrygonians. Genesis and the Book of Enoch used the Hebrew tradition to record them in history under the name Nephilim. The truth lies openly upon the page, clear and impossible to deny. These two completely independent cultures were both portraying a supernaturally hybridized race, possessing unmatched strength, a passion for violence, and an addiction to human flesh. During the remaining years of his life, Odysseus finally managed to drag his broken body back to Ithaca. But before he could place his feet upon the shore of his homeland, he was forced to cross a wilderness where ancient monsters remained waiting in ambush around damp caves and deadly straits. Mythology, in the final analysis, is not a collection of cheap fairy tales used to put children to sleep. It is the strongest and greatest vault that history has ever used to protect itself across thousands of years beneath the storms of time. And if Troy has already declared its own existence beneath the soil of Hisarlik, then the final question continues roaring and demanding a satisfactory answer from humanity. Polyphemus and the Laestrygonians were certainly never products of entertainment molded from the rich imagination of the poet Homer. Hidden deep beneath those names carrying the unmistakable sound of Greece, they are the final legacy, the most authentic and brutal criminal record of a tyrannical bloodline that once shook the world under the name Nephilim. Odysseus's 10-year journey finally came to an end when he returned to Ithaca, but the questions left behind by the Odyssey remain with us. After everything we have explored tonight, we cannot claim that Homer was recording a precise historical account of the Nephilim. We have no skeleton inscription or surviving Greek document that identifies Polyphemus or the Laestrygonians by the name Nephilim. Still, the similarities between these ancient traditions deserve serious attention. The book of Genesis speaks of giants who appeared during the age before the Great Flood. The book of Enoch expands that account by describing the Watchers, their giant offspring, and the violence that spread across the earth. Many ancient Near Eastern traditions also preserve memories of chaotic ages, unusual beings, and a great flood that changed the world. In Homer's epic, Odysseus repeatedly enters lands that exist beyond the familiar order of human civilization. He encounters Polyphemus, a one-eyed giant who lives in a cave, tends livestock, and completely rejects the Greek law of hospitality. He then encounters the Laestrygonians, a community of giants whose strength far exceeds that of ordinary human beings, allowing them to destroy almost the entire fleet in a single attack. The story then leads him to Circe, a woman capable of altering human perception and even human form. Next comes the Song of the Sirens, a sound powerful enough to make clear-minded sailors willingly guide their ships toward death. Finally, Odysseus passes Scylla and Charybdis before reaching the island, where the sacred cattle of the sun god are protected by a strict prohibition. When we examine each event separately, we can view them as imaginative creations from the mind of a gifted poet. But when we place them beside the stories of the Watchers, the Nephilim, the Great Flood, and ancient traditions describing a world once inhabited by abnormal beings, another possibility begins to emerge. Homer may have used the language of poetry to preserve memories passed down through many generations. The storytellers who came before him may have heard reports of unusual tribes, isolated communities, enormous animals they had never seen before, or dangerous locations across the sea. Over the centuries, historical memory, the experiences of sailors, and religious belief may have gradually blended together, eventually producing the version of the Odyssey that has survived to our time. It is also possible that the Greeks preserved in their own cultural language a distant memory of an age that the peoples of the ancient Near East associated with giants. This remains a hypothesis, but archaeology gives us a reason to be cautious before dismissing the entire epic as pure invention. For centuries, much of the modern world regarded Troy as nothing more than a location from poetry. Then excavations at Hisarlik in present-day Turkey uncovered multiple layers of ancient cities built one above another. Archaeologists still debate which particular settlement may be most closely connected to the war described by Homer. But the site demonstrates that at least part of the geography found in the epic belonged to the real ancient world. That does not prove that the Cyclopes existed. It does not prove that Odysseus encountered the Nephilim. But it reminds us that one story can contain history, collective memory, religion, and generations of narrative exaggeration at the same time. Thousands of years later, separating those layers becomes extremely difficult. Perhaps the most important question is not whether Homer recorded every detail with complete historical accuracy. The deeper question is, why so many ancient cultures separated by great distances told stories about an age of giant human beings, abnormal bloodlines, and a catastrophic flood? The Hebrew tradition speaks of the Nephilim. The Greeks told stories about giants, titans, cyclopes, and tribes of extraordinary size. Mesopotamian traditions described kings, heroes, and unusual beings associated with the age before the flood. Even though these stories developed in different directions, they share several recurring patterns that force us to ask where the original memory may have begun. Did ancient peoples simply happen to create similar stories? Did they borrow these stories from one another through trade migration and cultural exchange? Or did a real event community or ancient period once stand behind these traditions, with each culture preserving only one part of what had happened? This is where we must recognize the boundary between what the texts actually say and what we are attempting to infer from them. Homer never mentions Enoch. The Book of Enoch never mentions Odysseus. The Bible never identifies the Cyclopes as descendants of the Watchers. The proposed connection comes from comparing their shared characteristics: extraordinary size, overwhelming strength, violence, existence outside ordinary human society, and an association with an ancient age that had already come to an end. Those similarities are strong enough to raise serious questions, but more evidence would be required before they could become a historical conclusion. And that is how Sleep Codex approaches the stories of the ancient world. We do not have to believe that every detail in an epic is a modern-style historical report. We also do not have to dismiss the entire account as fiction. Between those two extremes lies a wide field of investigation where archaeology, ancient texts, geography, and oral memory can be placed beside one another. The journey of Odysseus reveals how vast and uncertain the ancient world appeared to the people who lived within it. Beyond their cities lay uncontrolled islands, coastlines that had never been accurately mapped, peoples who spoke unfamiliar languages and animals that an ordinary sailor might never have seen before. After a story passed through 3 or 4 generations, an unusually tall man could become a giant. A violent community could become a race of cannibals, and a dangerous strait could become 2 monsters waiting to swallow every ship that passed between them. Yet, exaggeration in storytelling does not mean that the story began with nothing. Behind Polyphemus, there may have been a memory of an isolated community that lived in caves. Behind the Laestrygonians, there may have been a hostile coastal tribe whose people were unusually large, heavily armed, and aggressive toward outsiders. It is also possible that these characters belong to a much older tradition in which memories of post-flood giants continue to survive throughout the cultures of the Mediterranean world. At present, we still do not have enough evidence to choose one final answer. So, I would like to hear how you understand this question. Do you believe Polyphemus was simply a character created by Homer to test the intelligence of Odysseus? Or could he reflect a memory of a real human population? Do you see the Laestrygonians as an exaggerated portrait of a hostile tribe? Or could they be connected to ancient traditions about giants? And what about Circe and the Sirens? Were those stories only descriptions of magic? Or could they reflect the way ancient people attempted to explain sedatives, poisons, sound ritual practices, and methods of influencing the human mind that they could not yet describe through scientific language? Share your thoughts in the comments below. You do not have to agree with every hypothesis presented in this video. What matters is that we can examine the evidence together, distinguish the texts from our interpretations, and continue asking serious questions about the ancient past. This is Sleep Codex, where we return to the Bible, ancient writings, and stories once labeled as mythology to investigate what may be hidden behind them. If tonight's journey helped you see the Odyssey from a new perspective, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows Sleep Codex to continue producing long-form videos that explore ancient documents, archaeology, and the historical questions that remain unresolved. And let us know which subject you would like us to investigate next. Polyphemus and the origin of the Cyclopes, the giant tribes of the Greek world. The similarities between Noah's flood and the flood traditions of the Mediterranean, or Odysseus's journey into the world of the dead. For now, tonight's journey has reached its resting place. You can relax your shoulders, let your hands rest, and allow your breathing to slow. The questions surrounding Homer the Nephilim and the ancient world remain. We will continue examining them in future investigations. You do not need to find every answer tonight. Let your body rest after a long day. Close your eyes when you feel ready. Keep your breathing slow and steady, and allow the sound of the story to gradually fade into the distance.
Thank you for spending this time with Sleep Codex. May you have a peaceful and deep, restful sleep. And I will see you again in the next video.